The next item of business is a debate on motion 159 in the name of Stephen Gethins on It's Scotland's Energy. I invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press their buttons, and I call on Stephen Gethins to speak to and move the motion. And you have 13 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Firstly, I move the motion, just to get that out of the way straight away. Presiding Officer, Deputy Presiding Officer, congratulations to you and to your colleagues for your appointment. Before I get into the meat of the debate today, if you'll permit me, I would also like to thank my predecessor in Dundee City East, Shona Robson, who was not only an outstanding minister, as I'm sure the First Minister will agree, but a tireless advocate for Dundee as well. I know she'll be greatly missed in this place. Can I also thank my predecessors in this portfolio, Gillian Martin, who's here with me today, but also Angus Robertson, not only for their tireless work in the portfolios that I cover, but also, I'm not embarrassed to say, some guidance and some valuable advice in my first days in the post as well. I'd also like to thank colleagues from across Parliament for their good wishes. I want to say straight off that it is my aim, and the First Minister said this about his own role, to work in a collegiate fashion, to agree where we possibly can, to disagree rigorously, and I'm sure there will be opportunities for that too, but agreeably where we can't. No party or MSP has a monopoly on wisdom, not least me, and I very much look forward to working with everybody in this chamber. And can I also say I'm so grateful to the good wishes that I've had from colleagues from other parties as well. I won't embarrass you, but it has been heartening. Thank you. Most of all, nobody will mind me saying, I'd like to thank the people of Dundee East for their faith in me, and also my thanks to the people in Dundee and Angus for the privilege of serving as their Member of Parliament. I'll miss the parts of the constituency that my colleagues Heather Anderson and Lloyd Melville are now fortunate enough to represent, but I'm absolutely determined to get stuck in for Dundee. Dundee is Scotland's yes city. It's a city where my own family were once migrants from Ireland. A city that, like the rest of Scotland, is at its best because of its diversity and its outward-looking nature. That enriches our industries and it enriches our society as well. And that informs my politics. That city informs my politics, as I know it does to other colleagues here as well. It's a city that has been in the heart of Scotland's successes in food and drink, higher education, journalism, and of course in energy. And that moves us to the fundamental points of our debate today. Today we're debating where decisions should be made. Are they better being made here, in Scotland's Parliament, that is voted on by the people who live and work in Scotland, or at Westminster? And whatever our views, surely it is one that Scotland's energy policies should be in Scotland's hands. Scotland is one of the most energy-rich countries in Europe, having won the natural lottery twice, once with hydrocarbons and again with its abundant renewables resources. Yet despite that, and do you know what? I am going to take an intervention, despite it being my first speech, and who better than the member for
Murdo Fraser. I would remind Mr Fraser that the convention is that there's no interventions, but the member has indicated that he's happy to take one.
My apologies to you, Presiding Officer, and to the member. He was so confident in his approach. I entirely slipped my mind. It was his first speech in this chamber. And can I very much welcome him to his place on the front bench as Energy Minister. But I wanted to ask him about the renewable energy he's talking about, which Scotland has benefited from, which of course is funded by subsidies currently paid by 70 million people across the United Kingdom. If he dismantles the UK energy market, as he proposes to do, will that not mean that those subsidies will then need to be paid by 5.5 million people living here in Scotland? And what would that do for bills being paid by consumers here?
Stephen Gethins.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I've got great respect for the member, and I thank him both for his intervention and for his welcome as well. I would urge him patience, but I will say merely this. Scotland is a massive exporter of energy. Other markets rely on our energy and have done so for decades. And, you know, this speaks, and I'm sorry to say it, to the isolationist approach that's been taken by the Conservative Party, who turn their back on a Europe that's coming together because of energy security, who turn their back on that. And isolationism is not a policy that our party will endorse, or a majority for that matter, in this Parliament. And I'm going to come on to that. Because yesterday, in energy-rich Scotland, we're facing increasing energy bills, just yesterday being increased by a Labour government that promised to reduce them, but it's putting them up. A country that produces more energy than it consumes. Now, just for context, Mr Fraser will be delighted by this, just for context, our oil and gas industry that sent £400 billion to the Treasury over decades, £400 billion, with very little in return and no long-term planning. Can you imagine a finite resource with no long-term planning, one of the few countries on earth never put together a future generations fund? That's why Westminster's failed, and that's why this place deserves to have full control over energy. And with renewables, renewables alone deliver 20.8 terawatt-hours outside Scotland annually. Now, to put that into context, that's worth £1.7 billion, and if we kept it in Scotland, would be enough to power every home in Scotland from that annual export for 3.5 years. What value to the rest of the UK, and what value to the whole of Europe as well? When it comes to European and UK energy security, lower bills should be part of the solution from where this is produced, but we have been let down. And that's why decisions about energy should be made here. And it's Westminster's track record, be it under the Conservatives, or those former Conservatives, or be it under Labour, where the track record means that Westminster no longer deserves to keep control. The disconnect between Scotland's energy wealth and the daily reality facing households is not inevitable. And we all talked, and I heard some fantastic speeches about the conversations that have taken place over the past few weeks. It is a consequence of a constitutional arrangement that leaves decisions about Scotland's energy in the hands of Westminster, delivering, in this energy-rich part of Europe, amongst the highest energy bills anywhere in Europe. And that should be a challenge for each and every one of us in this chamber. Now, the people of Scotland returned a government with a clear instruction: deliver the benefits of Scotland's energy wealth to Scottish households, communities and businesses. And that position, as set out by the First Minister, was endorsed by the electorate. And if we go in deeper into it, polling evidence came out during the election, you'll all recall this, I'm sure, whereby Ipsos survey last month told us that over 3/4 of Scots think there should be more devolution over energy, with just 14% bring together the Labour policy, Reform policy and Conservative policy, thinking it should be under Westminster control. I'm going to give way for a second time because I've got great respect for the member, and I'll do that now.
Michael Mara.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I also welcome the Minister to his position as a friend, as I consider him to be. I'm very delighted to see him in his place. He spent the election campaign talking about that independents could deliver a third off of energy bills in Scotland. Can he tell us how?
Stephen Gethins.
You know, first of all, I'm going to say in this spirit that I've got great respect for the member, and I thank his kind words, and I know he's an advocate for the North East and for Dundee as well. But he's got to understand that when we sit here, when we're exporting electricity, when the Treasury in London is benefiting, you could do stuff like having a social contract, for example, a social tariff, for instance, that would help lower the bills for those most in need. Just one thing that you could do. But this isn't just to benefit Scotland's citizens. I want to talk about this. I want to talk about the rest of my brief. Scotland, as a responsible and outward-looking member of the European family of nations. Now, yesterday, my first meeting in my external affairs brief was with the Ukrainian Consul General. Back in January, I sat for 2 nights in a bunker as the Russians bombarded Ukraine's energy infrastructure. That's because Europe needs to move closer together in a more dangerous world, something that parties that have turned their back on Europe do so at their peril and at our peril as well. We are rich and we should be thriving, and we're part of Europe's solution in terms of that energy crisis that it is. Now, others will be glad that I saw that for myself in Aberdeen this week, my first ministerial visit on Monday, and I'm grateful to colleagues from across the sector for meeting me. These businesses matter, and if we look at the net zero worth, the CBI report yesterday showed that industries are worth over £10 billion, worth 5% in total economic input, and employing over 100,000 people in jobs, something the member for Murray raised at FMQs today. We see that onshore and offshore, and our opportunity is set to grow. This could be game-changing for Scotland, with global capital expenditure of the value of around £100 billion coming down the track. Huge potential, which is held back by Westminster, not least in punitive transmission charging charges set by Westminster that are holding our industry back, which was cited to me by business. Now, this government's doing everything it can within its limited powers. We've used £150 million investment to attract wider investment and create a funding stack worth almost £900 million in projects across Scotland. I'm going to make some progress, and I wasn't particularly. I'm not sure. I got particularly good response from Mr. Fraser. So let me make a bit of progress, because this might not matter to the Conservative Party, but high energy bills matter to the people of Scotland. And a Labour government that came in promising that bills would be £300 lower, and yesterday another eye-watering increase means they'll be £300 higher. That's not good enough. The future lies in clean, affordable and secure power, strengthening affordability, resilience and competitiveness, but also protecting Scottish people and businesses from our energy bills being dictated by international events. Now, within the powers we have, the limited powers we have, we're already seeing reform of the energy consents process to enable to bring us forward more lower-cost renewable energy. We'll establish a Scotland Health Fund over the course of this Parliament, a Future Generations Fund that Labour and the Conservatives failed to establish for the oil and gas sector, more community ownership, and already delivering £15 million, deliver on the £500 million Just Transition Fund, and support the Acorn project for the North East for carbon capture and storage. Do you remember that, Tories? Carbon capture and storage. Now, these commitments, more immediately, we want to see updated guidance to public bodies on community use of public land and an assessment of the potential for placing solar panels in underused spaces. But this cannot be done within the current devolution process to meet our full potential. And that leads me to oil and gas. Few industries know the price of Westminster failure better than our oil and gas sector. North Sea oil and gas play a vital role in Scotland's energy system and security mix, and the excellence delivered by that workforce in the North East, who were let down by their wealth squandered by successive Westminster governments. No Future Generation Fund. Let's look to next door Norway. Next door Norway has a sovereign wealth fund worth £1.6 trillion, 6 times Scotland's GDP. Just think what we could have done with that. Now, the North Sea is a mature and declining basin, so it is vital we have a parallel track approach to the transition. That oil and gas production is managed alongside the increasing deployment of renewables, but a transition put at risk by the current Energy Profits Levy, accelerating North Sea oil and gas decline, but failing to give the support needed to renewables to ensure that just transition. That needs to be a fair approach, and it's why I'm afraid we can't back the motion by the Greens today. But that needs to be an approach for the North Sea, as the First Minister said today, on an evidence-led, case-by-case basis where climate compatibility and energy security tests are met. And I heard that in Aberdeen about that joined-up approach. I was also glad that Mr Flynn, in his first visit, went to Grangemouth, who have been so badly let down by Westminster, because climate action and a just transition to net zero brings benefits across Scotland, and we will support the creation of 500 additional jobs in the Grangemouth industrial cluster, and at the same time investing £9 million in support for workers in Mossmoran. Now, on community benefit, and we have to reject the Liberal Democrat motion because it does knock out the devolution, which Liberal Democrats were once in favour of those powers. But I will be working hard, and I look forward to working with the member, and I've got great respect for the member for Orkney, for Liam MacArthur as well, about how we can expand the work that's already been done. But let's not forget that's community benefits that last year alone delivered £30 million to our communities. So, in conclusion, and I think I'm reaching my conclusion, let me just say, a more energy-secure Scotland will see us build renewable energy generation that will lower bills, protect us from international shocks and secure good jobs for those currently employed in our offshore sector who bring so much to our economy. Scotland has the energy, it does not yet have the power. Our vast resources are amongst the best in Europe, but the people are not feeling the benefit. Westminster's had its chance. It failed. Now, what we're asking Parliament to do today is to empower this Parliament to be part of the solution across Europe on energy security, part of the solution locally, nationally and internationally, and vitally in people's homes. And I would ask my colleagues to back our motion today. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
I now call on Daniel Johnson to speak to and move Amendment 159.2.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I congratulate you and welcome you to your position? Can I move the amendment in my name? And can I begin on a friendly note and welcome Stephen Gethins to his position? He's somebody who I've known for a number of years. I'm sure I won't embarrass him by observing that we first met when we were student politicians. Let's hope we've raised the standard of debate a little bit since then. And indeed, I do wonder if this government will become something of a tale of two Stephens, because I think in Stephen Gethins we can see why the First Minister appointed him. He brings a mature approach, somebody who can be collegial, work on a cross-party basis. I'll let others decide what the analysis of the other Stephen might be. But look, it is important we talk about energy because it is something where we need a grown-up, rational conversation. Energy is at the heart of our economy and this country's future prosperity. But this motion does not augur well. Scotland's energy might make for a somewhat adequate T-shirt slogan, but it's an incoherent parliamentary motion and it's an entirely empty basis of policy. And could I just gently point out to Mr Gethins that I think his speech was rather heavy on rhetoric and rather light on actual analysis? Because the reality is, yes, we have seen a huge amount of investment in renewables in Scotland. We've seen £150 billion worth since 2014. Of the 45 gigawatts of renewable capacity of this country, 25% of it is in Scotland. 80% of UK wind generating capacity, if I can just finish this point, 80% of wind generation across the UK is in Scotland. But that is because of UK policy, driven by contracts for difference and before it the renewables obligations, which has driven investment by creating a lowered cost through underwriting those bills through strike prices. Now that costs the average UK bill payer £39 annually. What I would ask is the SNP saying that £39 be spread across just UK payers, because that would surely be hundreds of pounds worth per person per year? Happy to give way to Mr
Neil Gray.
I thank Mr Johnson for giving way, and he made a rather pejorative point around the difference between rhetoric and action. And I'm reminded of the promises that were made by the Labour Party in the up to 2024 election, where the Labour Party promised to reduce bills by £300, and have in fact seen prices rise by £300. Can we give an explanation as to why we are seeing such a rise, when we can see across Europe other countries investing in lowering fuel duty and lowering fuel bills for the residents in the wake of the issues being suffered by people from the invasion of Iran? And why is it that the UK government is not taking the action that other countries are? Daniel Johnson.
Thank the Minister for somewhat enjoying the new rules around interventions. But look, on the point, clearly, unless he's not aware, there's been some major international changes of circumstance. Average bills, especially for those drivers, had been going down. And most critically, if he's talking about lowest cost, I would ask him this. Where in Europe has the lowest electricity cost? France. 80% of their generation comes from nuclear. If we're going to have a serious argument on energy costs, let's have it, but let's have it on the basis of facts, not assertion and dogma, which is what we have from the SNP Scottish Government. So the reality of this, if the SNP are going to assert that independents would lower bills by a third, they need to explain how. Where is the excess? Because right now, electricity bills are underwritten by taxpayers to the tune of £39 annually. What would happen to contracts for difference under an independent regime or a devolved one? And is the SNP saying that Scottish bill payers would pick up that underwriting? Because the reality is the strike price has been above the wholesale electricity price, not below it. That is the reality, and those are the questions they need to answer if they want a serious debate on this. But I would also say is that we do need a serious debate, because there are a number of areas within devolved competence that we should be seeking to go further, faster. Why is it that the Scottish Government have not been progressing as quickly or as successfully around upgrades? Whereas the Consumer Scotland expected the schemes in Scotland to reach just 45% of fuel-poor households, that figure in England has been 95%. But on transmission and infrastructure charging and upgrades, we have failed to see the support in terms of the planning regime that we need to accelerate the progress. The reality is it takes 7 to 10 years for renewables projects to get through the planning system in Scotland. Comparable projects just take 3 to 4 years in countries such as Norway. Where has the progress been on heat networks? Where is the SNP's promised publicly owned power company? These are some of the many questions which are in devolved competence that we need to be examining. And on that, we need a debate. It's all well and good about talking about renewables, but we have had a public failure to have a debate and discourse about what that means in terms of infrastructure. We have had, and this is why we now see this being used as a political football, and one I think we need a candid discussion, because if we're going to have renewables generation, that will require the infrastructure to distribute it, not least of which to the rest of the UK, to where we want to sell that electricity. And that is infrastructure underwritten and paid for across the United Kingdom. So these are the things that we need to talk about. Let's, by all means, have that candid, mature debate about the future of our energy economy. But I don't believe that the motion we have today, or the proposal we have, are anything more than sloganeering and rhetoric from the SNP. Thank you very much.
And I remind the Chamber that the convention is that there shouldn't be interventions on a first speech. And I call on Duncan Massey to speak to and move Amendment 159.1.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I move this amendment in my name. I welcome everyone to their new roles, the Ministers and the Shadow Ministers, and delighted to rise for my first speech today. I do believe that this Chamber and this Government needs massive change, so I am encouraged by some of the talk of change that has been in the Chamber so far, especially the contributions from the Presiding Officer and his deputies. But I do remain concerned that real change will remain elusive, and that this Chamber, and especially this continuity government, remains out of touch, wholly self-satisfied and simply in a Marie Antoinette-like bubble. And nowhere is this more apparent than energy, where energy reality, is something that simply doesn't seem to get past the outer walls of here. Scotland, the UK and indeed much of Europe face a simple reality. Our energy system is not working. We have a fragile, overstretched grid, struggling to deal with intermittent renewables, unable to cope with growth opportunities like AI, and increasingly at risk of failure. We have a growing reliance on imported energy, particularly via French interconnectors and LNG tankers. And of course, we're destroying our own oil and gas, despite needing oil and gas for decades. But the main area of failure is the cost of our new energy system. We're facing an energy price crisis. Extremely high prices hurting consumers, but perhaps most obviously we have the highest industrial energy prices in the world, driving deindustrialisation. And we can see the damage from this clearly. Right across the UK and Scotland, we've nearly lost our primary steel industry. Industries like chemicals, pharmaceuticals, ceramics have all been hammered. Across the board, manufacturing is at a huge disadvantage. due to these high costs, and this is even more obvious in Scotland with the closure of Grangemouth Refinery, the closure of Mossmoran and the closure of the Alexander Dennis bus factory in Falkirk. And these problems are not caused by temporary gas price spikes. These are caused by net zero policies and particularly the overuse of expensive and intermittent renewables in the system.
I'd remind the Chamber there should be no interruptions in a first speech. I appreciate that the Minister did take interventions, but there still should be no interruptions.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. As Professor Dieter Helm of Oxford University succinctly puts it, not cheap, not homegrown and not secure. And that's where we're at. And these costs are being driven by two things. Firstly, the direct costs of renewables are very high, and we can clearly see this through CFD prices at the moment, and these subsidies are paid by the UK Government, on whom Scottish Wind is wholly dependent. And so, for example, in AR7, the most recent funding round, offshore wind is at £95 per megawatt hour, floating wind £215 per megawatt hour, and some of our older wind farms, such as Beatrice, at well over £200 per megawatt hour as well. And they're all index-linked, all on long-term contracts, so it's fixed to go up for nearly 20 years. And this compares with direct costs of gas around £50 to £60 per megawatt hour. And then secondly, the system costs imposed by renewables are even higher. These costs continue to grow. They're like the submerged part of an iceberg, making about 2/3 of our bills. And the reason for that is to support intermittent generation, we have to build out a vastly larger grid at huge expense, much larger than a conventional system, and also a huge ire and anger from our rural communities who do not want giant pylons or battery farms right across their back garden. And we also need to maintain 100% backup, which in Scotland and the UK is gas, in other European countries is coal. And this is adding huge costs, huge complexity and huge vulnerability. And this vulnerability is becoming an increasingly serious concern, with the risks of blackouts rising, just like in Spain last summer, and Scotland is going to be especially exposed. We rely on just two ageing conventional plants, Torness nuclear plant and Peterhead gas plant. Yet both could close in the early 2030s, making Scotland extremely vulnerable to blackouts and likely dependent on gas plants located in the north of England. So we have to start facing this reality, this energy reality. Renewables will definitely be part of the energy mix, but we have to recognise their high cost and limitations. And this brings me to our own oil and gas sector, a world-leading industry that is being crushed by deliberate policy choices. And despite the massive renewable investment, oil and gas remains essential. In the UK, 75% of primary energy still comes from oil and gas. Globally, the figure is 81% of primary energy from oil and gas. And we need to acknowledge that under all scenarios, the UK and Scotland will need oil and gas for decades. Transport fuels, key chemicals, just about every product in this room has oil and gas, and it's vital for heating and industrial processes. And paradoxically, the more renewables we add to the grid, the more flexible gas backup we need. So we need to maximise our own use of oil and gas resources rather than import them from neighbouring Norway or countries even further afield. And we can do this. The North Sea has a strong and vital future if we choose it. We need to urgently remove the Energy Profits Levy. We need unambiguous support for Jackdaw Rosebank and all new projects, unambiguous support for new licences and drilling, and this would revitalise our industry. So, as per my amendment, I call on this Parliament to be a vocal champion for the North Sea oil and gas industry, apologise for previous policies of lack of support for the industry, including the presumption against new development, and provide unambiguous support for Jackdaw and Rosebank and new drilling, calling for new planning laws if necessary. Because the benefits of a stronger UK oil and gas industry are enormous. Continued jobs, major tax revenue, greater balance of payments and greater energy security, with in particular the opportunity to reduce imports and especially greatly reduce or even end LNG imports. And of course, let's talk about emissions. UK emissions are now less than 0.8% of global emissions. Scotland's about 10% of that, so 0.08%. You know, not even a rounding error. And that number is just going to keep getting smaller and smaller as large nations like India, Indonesia, Pakistan, Nigeria continue to add more energy, especially gas and coal. And the UK is still around the 24th largest oil producer in the world, but that's only about 0.7% of world production, another rounding error in global terms. And furthermore, this Parliament should note that the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, has quietly removed its RCP 8.5 scenario, once again highlighting that the scientific consensus is not an emergency, but a slow, mild warming. A problem for sure, but not something that requires us to commit unilateral economic suicide and decimate every industry in this country. And this brings me on to another industry which this government has tried to destroy, nuclear. Emission-free, 24/7 reliable energy. Every industrial country around the world is now moving towards it, increasingly seen as vital for new technologies such as data centres, AI and robotics. Scotland used to be an absolute world leader here. We had 4 large plants across the country, cutting-edge research at Rolls-Royce in East Kilbride, cutting-edge research at Dounreay, and of course world-leading nuclear vessel operations at Faslane. We need to rediscover this because the world has turned. We need to re-industrialise. We need 24/7 cheap, reliable, localised energy for new technologies like AI, and Scotland needs to be part of this. So for me, summing up, it is simple. If we want real economic growth, we need a pragmatic energy policy, one that focuses on cheap, abundant, reliable energy, one that is driven by reality, not wishful thinking, one that acknowledges our current failing system, which has the highest industrial energy costs in the world, one that is backed by the broad shoulders of the UK government, and that means maximising our oil and gas resources in the short and medium term and transitioning to a nuclear-powered system over the long term, with renewables playing a complementary role rather than a dominant one. And this is how we secure cheap energy for everyone, ensuring that we can re-industrialise, protect our world-leading oil and gas industry and ensure we keep the lights on for Scotland's future. Thank you.
And I now call on Lorna Slater to speak to and move Amendment 159.3, and Ms Slater has 5 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. For a change of tone, the Scottish Greens do believe that Scotland's energy should be put in Scotland's hands, and we have long called for more powers for Scotland as well, of course, for Scottish independence. Presiding Officer, I move the amendment in my name. Scotland urgently needs to respond to the climate emergency, to cut the cost of living and to ensure our long-term sustainable energy security. It might come as a shock to my colleague that oil and gas is a finite resource. It isn't abundant. It's a declining basin. Every litre of oil and gas you pull out of that basin costs more than the litre before, and that's even if you expand investment in oil and gas. This is a declining industry. The cost of energy in Scotland is a challenge. Yes, I will.
Liam Kerr.
Well, the member does not, however, address the fact that demand is continuing to rise and it's not going anywhere. So where do you source the gas and oil to meet the demand?
Lorna Slater.
We need to manage that demand, and like the Scottish Government should have kept their commitment to reduce traffic kilometres by 20%. The Scottish Government should have brought that heat and buildings bill, which would have reduced energy demand to heat our homes. We can reduce the demand by changing how we use energy. But what the main problem for our energy in the UK, for our costs here, is the way that the UK government links energy, electricity and gas prices, preventing bill payers from benefiting from the low generating cost of renewable energy. And this urgently needs to change to allow for cheap renewable energy that I'm going to make some progress. Thank you.
It's a matter for the member whether she chooses to take an intervention.
They would boost industry and accelerate the decarbonisation of heat and transport. In the last term of Parliament, the Committee for Economy and Fair Work heard over and over again that the cost of energy is the main concern for business and industry. Next winter, the cost of gas and oil to heat homes is going to be nearly everyone's main concern. We cannot remain tied to the roller coaster of fossil fuel prices. We need to produce our own clean, sustainable and affordable energy from renewable sources. Throwing good money after bad, I'll take some more interventions in a minute. Let me make some progress. Throwing good money after bad to try to expand the North Sea oil and gas drilling just adds carbon to the atmosphere that we have to remove later on at great expense, or else it will drive up global temperatures with disastrous consequences for future generations. The world has far more fossil fuel than it can safely burn, and issuing licenses to extract fossil fuels from new sources is indefensible. I would like to congratulate Reform colleagues for finally managing to get an amendment to the debate in. Third time's the charm. But I am alarmed by the flat-out climate denial and indeed reality denial that is contained in this amendment. I will take an intervention if the member likes.
Duncan Massey.
Well, thank you. There's 2 points there, if I may. The first one was last year the UK paid £2.64 billion in CFD subsidies. That is the difference between the market price, driven by that expensive gas that you're talking about, and that CFD strike price. So that's the reality of it. CFDs are £2.6 billion more expensive. On the last price, would Lorna Slater acknowledge that the terms climate emergency and climate crisis are faith-based terms and not actually supported by the scientific consensus, or indeed not supported by the IPCC, which is the correct technical authority?
Lorna Slater.
I absolutely disagree with the member. Of course, the climate emergency is backed by climate science globally. And to condemn future generations to the future that exists if global warming gets to 3.5 to 4 degrees is a horrendous thing to do. The member does not include in his calculations there the cost of re-sequestering that carbon that is emitted. We've been letting the fossil fuel industry off scot-free because we let them pollute our atmosphere, raise the carbon emissions, and then we sit in this chamber thinking, oh goodness, how are we going to put in place CCS and other ways to sequester that carbon back? Public money trying to clean up that pollution that has been generated by private capital. So, no, I need to continue, sorry. Just so we're clear, in the UK, around £17.5 billion a year is spent on fossil fuel subsidies annually, on an industry that is fully established, unlike renewables, which is still a developing industry, and that's for both gas and oil. And that does not count tax breaks, which are, of course, a form of subsidy. Previous analysis from the Global Justice Now revealed that in 2024 alone, UK saw fossil fuel companies BP and Shell, which are among those who benefit from all this public support, made a combined total of £26.2 billion in profits. That's more than double the combined total of cuts made to the aid and welfare budgets in 2025. The head of BP in the UK has a base salary of £1.6 million, and her total compensation this year is expected to exceed £11.7 million. The UK handing more public money and tax breaks to these stinking rich polluters instead of investing and moving us to clean energy, locally generated from our abundant renewable resources, is unconscionable. In Scotland, anyway, our energy transition is underway, with excellent progress being made in moving to renewable electricity generation. Now we have the harder challenges of how we change how we travel, how we manage our land, and how we heat our homes. And this is exactly where the SNP government need to set out their stall and say how they would meet Scotland's energy needs if they did have the powers. Let me finish this thought. Spoilers. Rosebank AL are not climate compatible. So we need a plan. You can't wait to find out that they're not climate compatible. They're not climate compatible. So will the Scottish Government transition using the strategy defined in their own draft energy strategy, or will they continue to sit on the fence? I'll take the intervention.
Thank you.
Helen McDade.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Would Lorna Slater accept that there are children at the moment who are living in cold homes in Scotland because of the price of energy? And would she also accept that the Contracts for Difference subsidy that Duncan referred to, £2.64 billion, has had its share in causing our energy prices, which are 4 times that of the US?
Lorna Slater.
I do agree with the member on the point that there are families suffering in cold homes in Scotland. That's why we need that Heat and Buildings Bill to make sure that everyone in Scotland has a warm, affordable home. I disagree with the point on Contracts for Difference, because it is important to invest in renewable energy as it becomes an established industry. What's really distressing is that the oil and gas industry, which is already an established industry, is still raking in that public money, those subsidies, those tax breaks. They haven't needed it for years. They make billions in profits. As we move to renewable energy, of course it makes sense that we support those growing industries. That's how a just transition works. Certainly.
Stephen Kerr.
So, Ms Slater mentioned the evidence heard by the Economy and Fair Work Committee. I hope she would agree that the tone of that evidence was that we are causing the deindustrialisation of Scotland through the imposition of levies and other market interventions on our businesses. Hence, businesses are shutting down in Scotland and are offshoring their businesses to other parts of the world. So we are defeating our own purposes by pursuing the policy prescription that Lorna Slater is again putting before Parliament this afternoon.
Lorna Slater.
The member makes a few mixed points there. What I heard in evidence on that committee, which I know the member was also on that committee, was that businesses are struggling with the costs of energy. And everybody is really worried, particularly about spikes in those fossil fuel prices because of geopolitical events. We need to move away from that roller coaster and back onto sustainable energy that we generate here in Scotland. And that means renewable energy for the long term. A new report...
I advise the member she doesn't have time to take any more interventions.
A new report commissioned by the ECIU states that net zero industries contribute £10.2 billion of GVA to the Scottish economy and support over 150,000 jobs. An estimated 3,000 businesses are now part of the Scottish net zero economy, with 90% of these being small or medium-sized businesses. The Scottish Greens want Scotland to lead a renewables revolution, with £600 million of investment in onshore and offshore wind, tidal and solar, including redeploying millions of public funding that has been pledged to unproven greenwashing carbon capture and storage technologies. The government need to bring back that Heat and Buildings Bill to decarbonise Scotland's homes and buildings by 2045. With our abundant renewable resources, energy should be cheap in Scotland. But while Westminster holds the power, we can't make that happen. But it's time that we did. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
I now call on Liam Kerr to move to and speak to Amendment 159.4, and he has 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And let me open by congratulating Stephen Gethins on his appointment as Energy Minister, and then commiserating with him for having to prosecute such an evidentially lacking and indeed threadbare motion, because listening to this debate exposes the perils of reducing nuanced, data-driven policy areas to the narrow nationalist rhetoric of the SNP. You see, Presiding Officer, the consequences of the motion's call would be calamitous, whether that be regarding energy generation, household bills, the economy, or indeed the environment. So, for example, this government demands control over renewables generation and particularly continues to bank on intermittent and variable wind power. But it fails to mention that it already has power over, for example, seabed rights for offshore wind projects. Yet its handling of the ScotWind licences was so botched that last November Shell handed back the Campion Wind lease, having spent 18 months trying and failing to sell it. And in February, Audit Scotland launched a formal investigation into the ScotWind leasing round. But this government also fails to mention that without the UK Contracts for Difference regime providing crucial stability for high upfront costs projects, it is unlikely that any of Scotland's 3 gigawatts of operational offshore wind would have been built, let alone the fact that the ScotWind projects wouldn't have even got off the ground. And then there are the constraint payments, which in 2025 totalled somewhere between £340 and £380 million. So it is deeply irresponsible for this minister to propose this motion without addressing replication of the CFD regime or meeting those constraint payments, or indeed funding the transmission and storage upgrades required to integrate Scottish offshore wind, which it is estimated will cost up to £20 billion by 2030. Mr Gethins.
Stephen Gethins.
Presiding Officer, and thanks to the member for giving way. Can he tell me, does he think that that £400 billion that's gone to Westminster has been well spent with no resource given back, no future generations fund? And what's he make of the constraints payments that are holding back renewables that industry, even in my first week, have been raising with me persistently? Westminster's failed. Doesn't he agree?
Liam Kerr.
Fundamentally disagree. What we can point to, we all need to go out and look at the current infrastructure that's out there. That's what the money's bought, because we are part of, thankfully, a wholly integrated UK. And to suggest otherwise is deeply irresponsible. And that irresponsibility is most stark in the government's position on oil and gas, to which my amendment, which I now move, principally speaks. You see, Presiding Officer, the SNP motion says it wants control over North Sea oil and gas, yet it quietly ignores that its own January 2023 energy strategy, which states that this government has, and I quote, a presumption against new exploration for oil and gas. In other words, whilst oil and gas remains reserved, a Conservative government could and would reverse Labour's economically, strategically and environmentally disastrous ban on new exploration and production. But if the SNP got control, its own energy strategy makes clear the SNP would shut the North Sea. And the worst of it is, current domestic production from the North Sea meets around 40% of UK gas demand. Nearly half is brought in from Norway, which is drilling the same basin. In fact, whilst Labour and the SNP try to shut the North Sea and lose the taxes and the jobs, Norway licensed 70 new blocks in early 2026 and gave companies major tax incentives. Presiding Officer, we must not let decisions on North Sea energy fall into the SNP's hands. And remembering the renewables intermittency problem, the Minister utterly fails to address questions of baseload. Yet Torness, Scotland's last nuclear station, which generated around 17% of Scotland's electricity in 2024, will shortly be closed. But this government has used the powers it already has to block any new nuclear in Scotland, a decision which this chamber has heard time and time again in recent years is based on misinformation, prejudice and blind ideology. Finally, Presiding Officer, it is important that I address the issue of high energy bills, which the Minister was right is a real challenge and it's a real fear for people. The Minister tries to suggest, I will shortly, the Minister tries to suggest that getting energy powers would reduce those bills, but people need to hear the truth. For example, remember those constraint payments that are paid when wind farms generate excess power which cannot be transmitted or stored efficiently? Well, the way to reduce them is through major investment in transmission and storage infrastructure. That is largely funded through network charges on household gas and electricity bills, which adds around £108 a year to the average household bill. So perhaps in closing, the government will address how it would fund those network and storage upgrades were it ever to receive these powers, particularly in the context of a £5 billion black hole legacy left by the last SNP government. And nor is the Minister levelling with people that Scotland's bills have virtually nothing to do with licensing powers and everything to do with terrain, population density, climate, housing stock, rurality and the transmission and grid upgrades. Of course, one solution to high bills, entirely within this government's existing powers, would have been to use ScotWind revenues to reduce bills or invest in infrastructure or indeed put in a sovereign wealth fund. But the former Finance Secretary, his predecessor Shona Robison, chose not to do that and instead used that money to plug her own funding gaps in the Scottish budget. Mr Brown.
Alan Brown.
Thank him for giving way. If we go back to nuclear and constraint payments, it does He does realise one of the reasons that consent payments are paid is because nuclear is pumping baseload onto the grid and can't actually be turned off at that time. But also, new nuclear is going to cost about £50 billion. That's the estimated cost of Hinkley Point C. How are £50 billion nuclear power stations going to bring down energy bills?
Liam Kerr.
I'm afraid the deep ignorance of the SNP's nuclear policy is exemplified in that intervention. Nobody is proposing to build Hinkley C in Scotland. What we're looking at is small modular reactors, which absolutely could be built and indeed are being built, Alison Thulis. Presiding Officer, what Scotland needs is informed long-term strategic planning. A strategy which recognises the importance of oil and gas jobs, energy security, environment, the economy and skills, but which acknowledges the need for new nuclear baseload and does so alongside and in partnership with a balanced, managed transition to renewables, and details a serious long-term strategy for storage and transmission to genuinely reduce people's bills. What Scotland does not need is more ill-informed, superficial posturing from an SNP obsessed with grievance and manufactured divisions. That is why the SNP motion should be rejected and the Conservative amendment wholeheartedly supported. Thank you.
I now call on Liam MacArthur to speak to and move Amendment 159.5.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I welcome you to your post and hope you find it as rewarding a role as I certainly did over the last 5 years. Can I also offer my congratulations to the Cabinet Secretary? I may not have known him quite as long as some members in the Chamber, but he's somebody I have known for a good many years. I like and respect enormously. That respect is only diminished slightly by the motion that he's lodged for today. But on a more positive note, it has at least enabled the debate to take place that is certainly timely, certainly on the back of yesterday's energy price cap announcement. An announcement that I think we all recognise will see bills rise again, pushing more households into fuel poverty against the backdrop of an ongoing cost of living crisis. And while the principal cause of rising energy costs may lie in conflicts far away, the impact on people, on business and communities here is real and keenly felt, giving rise to a palpable sense of anger and anxiety. Irrespective of international events, though, it's also clear that the current system needs reform, whether that's in cutting the link with wholesale gas prices or implementing a transmission charging regime that is fit for purpose. It won't be easy, of course. Achieving energy security, affordability and sustainability is amongst the biggest challenges we now face. Sadly, the Government's motion seeks to simplify that challenge by framing it merely as a matter of constitution, ignoring the implications, as we've heard, of fragmenting the energy market, something none of those that provided briefings for this debate were calling for. A more productive exercise would be to look at the clear and numerous ways we can maximise Scotland's energy potential while also better protecting households and businesses. One such example, reflected in my amendment which I move, is the need to take community benefit far more seriously. Supporting the generation of cheap, clean energy is vital if we're to protect ourselves from the volatility of fossil fuel prices. But communities hosting renewable developments deserve to feel that benefit, both in strategic local investment, such as housing, and measures to bring down bills. And that's simply not happening right now. I see this in my own constituency, Orkney. The Energy Islands has been a pioneer in the sector for decades, yet we experience some of the highest fuel poverty levels anywhere. That cannot be right. Addressing this will require an overhaul of outdated guidance, as well as engagement with rural and island communities themselves. And lessons must be learnt too from the failures of ScotWind. Having sold off sites at bargain basement rates, ministers have then refused to transfer that revenue to communities and local authorities most affected. I'll take
Helen McDade.
Much. Would the member accept that the money that you were talking about going to communities comes from other communities, that the subsidies which go through that come to the energy companies through a pool which comes off people's energy bills? And we are also discussing how people can't afford their energy bills. So it's nice for the communities to get a new football field or an indoor hall, but that money comes because those companies have so much money coming from everybody who pays the bills.
Liam MacArthur.
Thank Ms McDade for that intervention. I think, as we have already heard, the subsidies going into the energy sector across the board are wide and extensive. I think the argument I'm making is that the communities that are directly affected by these developments need to see the benefit of that, not just in terms of reducing the bills, but more strategic infrastructure that is not, frankly, about new football parks or community halls. It's about strategic investment in infrastructure, such as housing that is in crisis in places like Orkney. In the context of today's motion, however, had the UK Government treated the Scottish Government in the way the latter is treating local councils such as Orkney and Shetland, we'd have heard some fairly unparliamentary language from somebody even as measured and diplomatic as the Cabinet Secretary. A different approach is required in future, one that ensures projects attract investment and deliver meaningful benefit locally. And while the Government calls for more powers, the fact is it simply hasn't kept pace with the scale of the change required. Even coming forward with an energy strategy itself was beyond the Government for most of the last session. In the absence of such a strategy, Scottish Renewables have called for clear statements of policy intent to give certainty to key sectors, such as marine, as well as create the conditions for growth. Essential too will be modernising grid infrastructure and properly resourcing planning and consenting to support development at pace. And we need to see both Scotland's governments working collaboratively in Scotland's interest, something I think to which Mr Gethins is well suited. In terms of oil and gas, the fact that this will remain part of our energy mix for years to come, I don't think should be about debate. But there is no world, however, in which we can continue to rely on the North Sea Basin indefinitely. That's not a matter of politics. That is just an immutable fact of geology. But the futures of oil and gas and renewables are intertwined. Polarising policy and debate may have political upsides, but it has few upsides for either sector or our country. Indeed, any transition that ignores the needs of those upon whom it will rely most heavily can only fail. And the people and communities at the heart of this transition must be fully involved in the decisions that affect them. That will require removal of barriers to transition, better targeted support in training and skills, as well as investment in the development of genuine job opportunities. None of this will be easy. All of it will require detailed planning, long-term commitment and collaboration across parties and between governments. But trying to achieve it while incurring the significant costs, delays and disruptions that would result from dismantling our energy market would be beyond difficult. I urge Parliament to reject the motion and to back our amendment.
Now move on to the open debate, and our first speaker making their first speech is Jack Middleton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful for my first opportunity to address this chamber as the newly elected MSP for Aberdeen Central. My constituency rests between two shining rivers, the Don and the Dee, and absorbs all of Aberdeen city centre. Famed for its silver granite and golden beaches, I'm proud to call my constituency home. It's where I was born, and it's where my family have lived for generations. So too is Aberdeen home to many famous sons and daughters. The Ballon d'Or winning footballer, Denis Law. The multi-Grammy award-winning singer, Annie Lennox. The socialist revolutionary, Bob Cooney. And of course, the self-titled King of Aberdeen himself, Mr Kevin Stewart. By serving his constituents with dedication and passion for 15 years, Kevin ultimately laid the groundwork for what was a resounding election victory for the SNP in Aberdeen Central. As both an Aberdonian and a friend, I hope you'll join me in thanking Kevin for what he achieved in this Parliament and wish him the very best for the future. There's so much to be proud of in Aberdeen Central, but, Presiding Officer, in the energy capital of Europe, far too many of my constituents live in deprivation. Too many can't afford to feed themselves, feed their kids, or even turn their heating on. Many, many more live on the margins, struggling every single day to simply make ends meet. In a city that's a global energy superpower, that reality makes me sick. It should make every MSP in this chamber feel sick too. During my election campaign, I spoke to thousands of Aberdonians who told me that they don't feel the current political system delivers for them. No wonder. In Aberdeen Central, hard work doesn't always lead to job security, especially for our oil and gas workers. And while London politicians argue about how they want to spend our energy wealth, we pay some of the highest bills in the continent. My city faces many challenges, but I know the answers to those challenges don't lie in the tired old politics of the past, nor do they lie in hatred or within division. The answers to those challenges lie outside the walls of these chambers and within the sovereign people of Scotland. Presiding Officer, key to understanding what's happening today in Aberdeen Central is an acknowledgement of what's not happening. When it comes to our vast energy wealth, Westminster calls the shots, and the UK Government has no pride in Scotland's premier industry. They promised to remove the Energy Profits Levy and move to an oil and gas price mechanism. They've not done so. They promised to bring thousands of jobs to Aberdeen through GB Energy. They've not done so. Aberdonians are asked to ignore this reality. All the while, Labour lift sanctions on Vladimir Putin's regime and wave through dirty Russian oil and gas via the back door, while blocking use of our own domestic resources. They talk us down. They tell us to keep our mouths shut. But, Presiding Officer, let me be crystal clear this afternoon on behalf of my constituents. There isn't anything morally just about sending thousands of working women and men to the job centre during a cost of living crisis of Westminster's making, with little prospect of them regaining employment in the industry in which they've honed their skills for years. There isn't anything progressive about blowing up the investment and infrastructure supply chain that we need to secure Scotland's future as a green renewables powerhouse. Frankly, Presiding Officer, I don't think those in charge at Westminster have a clue. Your average punter in the north east of Scotland has a greater understanding of industry and Scotland's energy requirements in their pinky finger than the boffins and bean counters in Whitehall who rarely venture beyond the M25 will gain in their entire careers. So why on earth, I ask the Chamber, why on earth would we continue to put our trust in these charlatans who want to exploit Scotland's energy resources to simply fill the coffers of the UK Treasury and perhaps, if they're lucky, drive down bills for taxpayers in England? If we want things to change, very obviously, Scotland's huge energy wealth has got to be in Scotland's hands. Presiding Officer, to visualise what this would look like, we need not dream, we need not imagine. We just need to look a few hundred miles across the North Sea to Norway. Stavanger is a city of broadly similar size to Aberdeen. They discovered oil off their shores at virtually the same time as us too. Yet they've much lower poverty, they've much higher wages and they've much greater job security. And the cherry on top is that they enjoy a quality of life and living standards that's the envy of the world. The Norwegians use the discovery of oil to become wealthier. Yet in Scotland, by most metrics, we've somehow become poorer. It's because while we entrusted Westminster with our energy wealth, Norway trusted themselves. They understood one simple principle: a nation's resources should be used to benefit a nation's citizens. It's why their sovereign wealth fund is now larger than the GDP of most Western democracies. If Scotland had had the power to make the same choices as Norway did back then, a Scottish sovereign wealth fund would be worth over £1 trillion by the end of this Parliament. But I accept we can't go back. We can, however, go forward and prepare for the future, because we have North Sea resources that will last for decades and a renewables potential that should last forever. Presiding Officer, in closing, the choice we face in Scotland is if we trust them, the folk who threw £400 billion in taxes from our oil revenues up against the wall, or do we trust ourselves, the people of Scotland, to make decisions in our interests on issues like new licences to ensure huge energy wealth is serving our citizens? The next step in securing that very future is supporting the motion in Stephen Gethin's name today. Thank you.
I call Paul Sweeney to be followed by Karen Adam. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I welcome you to your place. And I also congratulate the member for Aberdeen Central on a fine maiden speech. It was an excellent and erudite tour of the Granite City, and whether it's the Granite City or indeed the Sandstone City that I represent, the challenges facing our people are very similar. But I'm afraid, Deputy Presiding Officer, that the Government's motion is merely an economic and political sleight of hand. Scotland's energy in Scotland's hands is certainly a plausible slogan, an intuitive one to anyone who cares about our country's interests. But the stark reality behind it is that the SNP's 20-year betrayal of our nation's proud electrical engineering heritage is a real one. For 2 decades, this administration has systematically dismantled Scotland's baseload generating capacity. They have replaced real engineering substance and Scottish ownership with handouts to multinational capital, foreign control, imported infrastructure and hollow photo opportunities to boot. We must judge this government by its actual record, not its rhetoric. And in 2021, we witnessed the spectacle of the former First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, ceremoniously pushing the button to demolish the iconic chimney stack at Longannet Power Station. It was the ultimate visual metaphor for this government, destroying foundational world-class energy infrastructure without a backup plan for the sake of a fleeting headline. They did so in defiance of Scotland's greatest engineering minds. In 2015, the much-missed Sir Donald Miller, the legendary former chairman of Scottish Power and Scotland's foremost electrical engineer of his generation, the man who designed Scotland's post-war electricity supply system, delivered a devastating warning that this government chose to completely ignore. And his prophecy has sadly become our painful reality. He warned us plainly: the decommissioning of our conventional generation is fast approaching, and yet there are no plans to replace the generating capacity at Longannet or the nuclear stations. With the closure of Longannet, Scotland will be left with only around half of its peak demand capacity. It is incomprehensible that a country with Scotland's energy resources should find itself in a position where it is entirely dependent on its neighbour for security of supply. Sir Donald looked at this trajectory and asked the fundamental question that every member on the government benches should be forced to answer today. You may wonder why Scotland, birthplace of so much engineering, should be importing power we could well generate here and exporting highly skilled jobs in the process. He concluded that this drifting, ideologically driven approach would leave Scotland with the least reliable and insecure electricity supply that we have seen for 100 years, warning us that failing to secure base load capacity would make for a very long night indeed if we don't get it right. And his prediction has proven to be accurate, an accurate guide to Scotland's present reality. Because of the government's catastrophic mismanagement of our energy sector, Scotland is now regularly forced to import power from England on calm days just to keep the lights on. Scotland has become more dependent on our southern neighbours, not less, due to the government's own policy. Yes, I have to give way.
Mr Gray.
I thank Mr Sweeney for giving way. Will he reflect on the fact that regardless of the energy generation that is chosen in Scotland, one of the greatest hindrances to our progress is access or offtake from the national grid, and that has been singularly failed to be improved under either a Conservative government or indeed a government under his party?
Minister, for making that point, and indeed it is a model that is challenging. Even when our wind turbines are generating under the integrated UK market, it's English bill players that heavily subsidise Scottish grid bottlenecks. Around a quarter of Scotland's entire wind generation was paid to turn off last year, accounting for over 90% of total constraint payments across the GB network. And look at the Moray East wind farm for an example of that. Between September 21 and September 23, the owners were paid to approximately £100 million in constraint payments just to sit idle. Currently, these costs are socialised across the whole UK market, but if full devolution of energy was to take place, then the Scottish Government's own approach to energy would mean that those costs on constraint payments would fall entirely on the shoulders of Scottish taxpayers. Unlike what we have already heard in this debate by many in the Government's benches, further devolution of energy would actually be neither quick nor cheap for Scotland's people. The hypocrisy of this motion, therefore, reaches its peak when we look at the SNP's attitude towards our own industrial supply chain. They spent weeks screaming about sabotage when the UK government rightly blocked the Chinese state control firm Mingyang from developing a wind turbine factory Ardersier. But let's be entirely clear, the European Union explicitly views these state-subsidised entities as security risks and systemic rivals to the European OEMs. So we cannot claim to be pro-European while rolling out the red carpet for a foreign supply chain that actively undermines our own European allies and undercuts domestic firms. It is geopolitical illiteracy And indeed, we can contrast that with the decision to invest. Happy to give way if I can have the time back.
The British government that vetoed Mingyang and has not given us an adequate record, and I know members from the Highlands and Islands will be rightly furious about that. It was also a British Labour government that just last week eased sanctions on Russia. Yeah. What did our European partners make of that?
Yeah. Paul Sweeney. Well, the British government did no such thing. It introduced new sanctions on Russia. It did not remove sanctions. And indeed, if the minister would like to look at real and serious industrial strategy, he can look at the recent UK government coup of securing the Vestas nacelle manufacturing plant for Scotland, bringing real high-skilled manufacturing jobs back to our shores through British market stability. Indeed, in the 1980s, Glasgow's own James Howden and Company led the world in wind turbine manufacturing, a position we had surrendered by the 1990s because we lacked an integrated state development strategy. We have a historic chance now to right that wrong today, but we do it through secure alliances, a robust grid and nuclear baseload, not by returning to the same old stale arguments of 2014 that have led to stagnation and decline. Power pooling across the United Kingdom protects Scottish consumers, funds our infrastructure and secures our industrial future. So let us reject this short-sighted, headline-driven motion. Let us honour the legacy of Sir Donald Miller and let us finally build a serious energy strategy around grounded engineering reality that will power Scotland's homes for generations to come.
Hear, hear. Call Karen Adam to be followed by David Barrett.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I want to welcome you to your role. It is an absolute honour to stand here again as the MSP for Banffshire and Bucking Coast. And I want to be clear from the very start that in my constituency, the energy is not a theoretical debate. We see it, we work in it, and we live beside it, but still too many people pay through the nose for it. From Buckie to Banff, along the coast of Fraserburgh, St Fergus, Peterhead and Bodham, Banffshire and Bucking Coast is rural, coastal and in some parts industrial. So it's very skilled and importantly, it is energy rich. We have families who have built their lives around oil and gas, and our young people are already training for the renewable and low carbon industries of tomorrow. This is not a place that needs energy explained to them from any distance, and this is a place that has helped power this country for decades. And during my campaign, I was asked to speak up for constituents and not shy away from the difficult questions. As almost every single door I knocked, they rose the issue of energy. St Fergus regularly supplies around a third of the UK's natural gas. Peterhead Power Station provides essential flexibility to the grid. Murray East, operated and maintained from Fraserburgh, and Murray West, with its operations and maintenance base at Buckie, sit off our coast, generating power on a scale that most countries would envy. And Acorn at St Fergus shows how carbon capture, utilisation and storage, alongside hydrogen, could help make the North East central to the next chapter of Scotland's energy future. And I'll give way.
Liam Kerr.
Grateful. On that Acorn point, the Acorn carbon capture project was promised £80 million by this government in January of 2022. To date, not a single penny has been paid out. Can she tell us when it will be?
Karen Adam.
Yep. I would like to remind the member I'm not a member of the government, so I don't have that facts to hand here. But there was pledged investment to the Acorn project to match and support what the UK government had put into it. But I can tell you this, the UK government snubbed the Acorn project, left it in a back burner, and it was pure politics, because they don't want Scotland having anything. So the question I bring to this chamber is simple. How can communities that help power the country still have households who cannot afford to heat their homes? And that's not just unfair, it's a failure of how energy is governed. Citizens Advice Scotland's latest energy briefing lays bare the human cost of that failure. The average energy debt was over £2,800, and that was rising to £3,200 in rural areas. Now, that's not just a statistic on a page. That is someone sitting in a cold house, trying to stretch the shopping, worrying about fuelling the car, worrying about being able to afford to fill up the heating oil, to provide for their bairns, and all the extra costs that come when you live further away from the centre of power. And that is why this debate does matter. The range of amendments before us shows exactly why Scotland needs these powers in Scotland's hands, because while others pull the debate towards delay, denial, dependence or unrealistic simplicity, my constituents need a serious Scottish plan rooted in jobs, bills, yes, climate responsibility and, importantly, a community benefit. At one end, there are those who speak as though net zero itself is the problem, and as though Scotland should turn away from the renewables, hydrogen, carbon capture, grid upgrades, apprenticeships and offshore wind developments that young people in my constituency and across the North East are already preparing for. And I cannot accept that. That would not protect Banffshire and Buchan Coast. It would strand us. It would leave communities with nothing to transition into. And we have seen before what happens when industrial communities are told that the market will sort it out. Thatcher did that to the coalfields. But I also cannot support the premise that we can simply walk away from the domestic oil and gas before the infrastructure, jobs and alternatives are fully in place. So we must work at pace. My constituents are fearful, and they consistently raised with me that oil and gas demand has not disappeared. And they asked and questioned me whether the energy we still use should be produced domestically by our own skilled workforce under our standards while we build the transition properly, or whether we make ourselves more dependent on imports, global shocks and political decisions from far away from Scotland and far away from the people who do not care about our communities. So we must offer reassurance that we are cognisant of this in any energy planning. For more than 50 years, Scotland's energy wealth has flowed to the UK Treasury, with hundreds of billions taken from oil and gas production, yet too many of our communities are still waiting to see the long-term investment that should have followed with. Now, this debate, it's not about choosing one energy source over another. In Scotland, we have it all. We need to balance a full energy mix to strategically lead us forward through to what comes next, but we need to have the power to do it our way. Our offshore workers are not yesterday's story either. They are the people who built the skills base that the future depends on. The offshore energy sector supports 128,400, as far as the stats allow today, jobs in Scotland, and 90% of offshore workers have transferable skills that are essential for the expansion of renewables. That is the serious path. Not shutting down our industrial base, not pretending climate change is not real, not leaving Scotland dependent on Westminster decisions, unfair taxation, UK market rules, unfair transmission charges or imported energy from other countries. Energy-rich Scotland should mean energy-secure Scots. It should mean skilled jobs, lower bills, stronger communities and a real industrial future of energy resilience. In Banffshire and Buchan Coast, we help power this country. It's Scotland's energy. It should be in Scotland's hands. Thank you.
Making their first speech, I call David Barrett, to be followed by Mark Simpson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I want to begin by paying tribute to my predecessor, Annabel Ewing. Annabel spent decades in the service of Scotland and was a formidable voice for the Cowdenbeath constituency. She was vocal on issues like improving the rail services on the Fife Circle, on defending our hard-working and essential fire crews, and she fought for investment in the replacement Lochgelly Health Centre, something I will, constructively, continue to press for. As I walked into this building for the first time earlier this month, I found myself recalling a visit many years ago, when I was still in primary school, and the Parliament was still under construction. Alongside thousands of school children across Scotland, I had drawn a picture of myself to be displayed on the construction hoarding around the site, a project intended to symbolise the generations this Parliament was built to serve. I remember spending what felt like hours hunting for that drawing, and I would love to say that that visit inspired me to seek election one day, as I hope visits here inspire many young people now. Truthfully, I suspect I was more excited by whichever came after. I can't remember if it was the Edinburgh Zoo or Dynamic Earth. Still, reflecting on that visit, it struck me how strange this term must feel for those that have been here ever since then, and for this to be the first Parliament without a Ewing among us. I promised to do my bit to inject a little Ewing spirit into defending the people I represent. Presiding Officer, I can already feel the whips getting nervous, so I should move on. The tradition of a first speech is that I should try to shoehorn in references to my constituency. In Cowdenbeath, on the subject of energy, that's not difficult. Cowdenbeath is a constituency forged by both energy boom and energy decline. Our mining heritage shaped our communities and powered our economy and our nation. Its decline was rapid and it was devastating, leaving families and communities broken. It was the very antithesis of a just transition, and that legacy lives on today. It lives on in deprivation, in communities vulnerable to rising energy costs, and in places too often that feel left behind. But it also lives on in the character of our communities, proud, resilient, and deeply tight-knit communities that I am profoundly honoured to represent. They are my first priority, and I will not let them down. Today, the constituency faces a new wave of energy development, vast solar farms, towering wind turbines, and a massive grid infrastructure in the form of EGL4, a high-voltage cable linking Ballingree to Norfolk, a cable of over 600 kilometres, capable of transmitting 2 gigawatts of clean, green Scottish energy to homes in England. Ballingree is a proud community with deep roots in its mining heritage, but it is also a community surrounded by energy wealth, while too often seeing little of that benefit. Presiding Officer, that cable will transmit electricity from an area to an area in England with lower standing charges than in Scotland itself. Energy sent from Ballingree will cost less in Kings Lynn than it does for those who live in Ballingree. I do not object to the principle of energy infrastructure. I spent the best part of 15 years working in renewables and energy as a hydrologist and an environmental consultant. What I object to is communities not feeling the benefit. What I object to is Scotland not having powers over its own energy. Scotland stands on the cusp of another renewable energy boom, but that was true a decade ago. So why are we still paying some of the highest energy bills in the world while producing so much energy? And the answer is simple. We don't have powers over our own energy. In 2015, the UK government under David Cameron systematically dismantled support mechanisms for renewables, devastating the then growing small-scale wind, hydro and solar sectors. And I say funding mechanisms, support mechanisms, I don't say subsidy. It's never subsidy when it's nuclear, is it? The strike price for Hinkley after inflation is over double that of most offshore wind, and that says nothing about the cost of nuclear waste. With greater powers, perhaps, we could invest in some of that difference in smarter grids, in insulation, efficiency, and greater heat and energy storage. While I discuss what the UK did in 2015 to undermine our renewables industry, at that time, I was helping take a small-scale hydro scheme through the consenting process. Construction very nearly didn't go ahead because the funding structures were ripped away with virtually no notice. It was only through the intervention of then Scottish Government Minister for Energy, Fergus Ewing, yes, another Ewing reference, that the project was ultimately completed. The Scottish Government moved heaven and earth to salvage what it could, with one hand tied behind its back. We're now a decade on, over a decade on, with very little hydropower having been developed since. That is not because the resource isn't there in vast and untapped quantities, but because the resource is predominantly in Scotland. And when decisions are made elsewhere, Scotland's priorities will never come first. For too long, decisions about Scotland's resources have been made elsewhere. and our communities have paid the price. Scotland's energy should be in Scotland's hands, and in Scotland's hands, it could power our future.
Making their first speech, I call Mark Simpson, to be followed by Pauline Stafford.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and my congratulations on your election to the post. It probably goes without saying that I'm delighted to be standing here today representing North East Scotland, a place that I'm proud to call home. I want to start by being thankful. I want to be thankful to the 383,000 Scots that voted for reform across the country. Really, it is an honour, and we want to thank them all. Across North East Scotland, 60,000 voters responsible for putting me in here personally. Again, I want to be very thankful to them. We have volunteers across the region that I want to be thankful to, from Peterhead to Braemar to Dundee. We've got 2 by-elections going on in the North East. They're still going at it hard, campaigning, so again, my thanks to them. I want to note that this is the first time that reform have been in this Scottish Parliament, and we do not take this lightly. I want to say it's been disappointing what some of my new colleagues have said about locking reform out of influence, saying rather we were not here, but here we are, and we hope that we can collaborate where there are areas of coming together. During the campaign, people I was speaking to, I asked them a simple question: what is getting better for you? There wasn't a great deal, but I will share some of what they said to me. They brought up the cost of living. These people have seen their disposable incomes not raise and not get any higher compared to a decade ago. Families are being forced choosing between heating their homes and putting food on the table. It's simply not acceptable. On tax, people have never been taxed higher. Those earning £50,000 in Scotland are paying £1,500 more tax compared to the rest of the UK. Top-rate taxpayers are paying 48% tax. People are feeling like they have less and less cash in their pocket. On safety and on crime, recorded rapes and attempted rapes reached almost 3,000 in the year 2024 to 2025. That is a 15% increase on the previous year, and that is something that should shame us all deeply. In schools and education, we've seen the PISA scores declining significantly over the last decade, especially in areas of maths and science. Again, we need to make sure that our children are given the best possible start in life. There were also UK-wide issues that Scots were voting on in these elections. One of them was on immigration. Over the bank holiday weekend, we saw around about 1,000, mainly young men of fighting age, coming over the English Channel. This has resulted in Glasgow becoming the asylum capital of the UK. On net zero and on energy, pertinent to what we're discussing today, again, the policies of the establishment parties have failed the average Scot. We have what the SNP did, bringing in net zero by 2045, 5 years ahead of the UK. The SNP talk of a just transition for oil and gas workers. The sad reality is there is no such thing as a just transition for oil and gas workers. The reality is 1,000 jobs per month are being lost in the North East. We've got Labour. I won't spend too long talking about Labour. Their failings are pretty apparent. But if you look at Ed Miliband, banning new drilling and then their windfall tax. The Conservatives, again, not much better. They brought in the Energy Profits Levy. They also brought in the legislation that meant we had to drive and achieve net zero by 2050. And they're not even here. What now? Those are some of the problems. What are Reform UK going to do to change this? On energy and on the North Sea, we are going to abandon net stupid zero and we are going to get the North Sea pumping again. In doing that, we are going to bring back thousands of jobs, billions of pounds in tax revenue, and we are going to stop importing oil and gas from Norway and gambling on unreliable renewables. On immigration, we have a very simple policy. Anyone that has entered this country illegally will be detained and deported. We will make sure that women and girls are safe from these mainly fighting-age men that are coming over the channel. On tax, we are going to make sure we believe a pound in your pocket is better than a pound in the government's hands. We want to give people money back in their pockets to stimulate growth. We believe in trusting the Scottish people. I will conclude now by saying we are looking forward to the next 5 years. Reform have been trusted for the first time to deliver for Scotland, and what we want to be judged on at the end of those 5 years is how we can positively make the message for reform being able to deliver the solutions to the woes of many, many Scots. Thank you.
Making their first speech, I call Pauline. Beg your pardon. To be followed by Heather Anderson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I congratulate you on your new role. I have to start by making a declaration of interest as an elected member of West Lothian Council. Presiding Officer, I am delighted to make my first speech in this chamber representing the new constituency seat of Bathgate. This is an area that I grew up in and where I'm now raising my own family. And I'm deeply grateful to the voters of the constituency for placing their trust in me to represent them, and I will work every day to support them and to give them a voice in our Parliament. The Bathgate constituency sits right at the heart of Scotland's energy and industrial story, so I'm really pleased that my first contribution to a debate could be this one on Scotland's energy. But before I turn to the motion, I want to pay tribute to my predecessor, Fiona Hislop. If there are any other new members in the chamber concerned about the size of the boots that they have to fill, please spare a thought for me. As one of this Parliament's longest-serving MSPs, Fiona spent over 16 years in government, and her work has made a huge difference to the lives of people right across Scotland. So I want to thank Fiona for her work and wish her all the best for her future. There is nothing that better demonstrates the need for Scotland to have control of its own resources and decision-making than the issue that we are debating today. My election campaign began with a focus on Scotland's energy. With almost a third of households in Scotland living in fuel poverty, it was an issue that resonated clearly with almost everybody that we spoke to on the doors. We had assumed, however, that as we headed into spring with warmer weather, people's focus would then turn to other issues, but this did not happen. As the UK found itself buffeted by events in the Middle East with soaring oil and gas prices for a second time and a UK government unable or unwilling to meet the scale of the challenges facing people, energy security came even more sharply into focus. Further, just last week we saw the UK government panicking over their failure to manage energy infrastructure and watering down its sanctions on Russian oil, a betrayal of the Ukrainians fighting so hard for their democracy. The closure of Grangemouth refinery, where many of my constituents worked, has clearly contributed to this. And where are the benefits of the much-hyped GB Energy? A year since its creation and just 30 permanent jobs to show for it. It does not meet the scale here. It is this disconnect between what people hear from a UK government, the energy that they see being created all around them, but the lack of the tangible improvement that this makes to their lives that is so damaging to our democracy. It pushes people to the conclusions that it may not be worth voting at all, and it leaves space for the narrative that dealing with the climate crisis is something that we can put on the back burner until another day. It cannot. Scotland's energy needs to be in Scotland's hands, with all its energy powers devolved to the Scottish Parliament. Just as we've seen the closure of the last commercial oil refinery in Scotland at Grangemouth, the world's first was pioneered in Bathgate by James Paraffin-Young in 1850. Communities across my constituency, Whitburn, Blackburn, Winchborough, Broxburn, Uphall, Blackridge and Armadale, all bear the physical legacy of this era and decades of coal and shale mining. And the striking red shale bings that you see, the red giants that rise across the area, remain enduring symbols of the skill and the labour of generations of workers that powered Scotland. But the constituency has also known the pain of deindustrialisation, the loss of jobs, opportunity and confidence that affected so many families across Scotland. The Proclaimers captured this sense of loss in their song Letter from America with the famous lyric, "Bathgate no more." But while that reflects one chapter of our history, it must not define our future. Today, our task here and my task is to make sure that it is Bathgate once more.
With control of our vast renewable resources, we can be at the leading edge of the next energy revolution. We cannot leave this in the hands of Westminster, who have squandered Scotland's energy wealth to date, and risk repeating the mistakes of the 1980s, where towns who had their industry closed down were left to bear the social and economic costs alone. Instead, the move to clean energy must deliver secure, skilled and well-paid jobs here in Scotland, with investment rooted in communities like Bathgate, Whitburn and Armadale. That means not only generating renewable energy, but giving communities a real ownership stake and building the infrastructure of the future here at home. We have seen what that future can look like through initiatives like the Eco House at West Lothian College, a green skills centre of the first of its kind in Scotland, or in companies like Invinity Energy Systems in Bathgate developing grid-scale battery technology. It is already happening. Young people in our communities should be able to look at our net zero transition and see not uncertainty but opportunity, good jobs, apprenticeships and a future that they can build right here in Scotland. Many members today will have travelled through to the Parliament through the Bathgate constituency by rail or by the two motorways that dissect us. As you pass the Shielbings, please consider what these red giants represent. Generations of skilled, resilient people who worked hard to see Scotland prosper and grow. This cannot be the best that their legacy bears. With Scotland's energy in Scotland's hands, we can build an energy system for our future. Communities in Bathgate and those across Scotland will not only share in that future but help lead it, just as they helped power Scotland's past. Thank you.
Making their first speech, I call Heather Anderson, to be followed by Christopher Leask.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'll begin by making a declaration of interest. I'm an elected councillor in Dundee City Council, and I congratulate you on your election. I'm very honoured to address the Parliament as the newly elected MSP for Dundee City West. The young lassie from up a wee multi in Lochee never dreamt that she would be standing here in Scotland's national Parliament, representing the warm, funny, strong and resilient people of bonny Dundee. Presiding Officer, colleagues in this chamber may not know that William Wallace is a former pupil of what is now known as Dundee High, and they may not know that I was the former head girl of the Morgan. But they will know that Dundee is famous for the 3 Js: Jam, Jute and Joe Fitzpatrick. My mighty predecessor, who served in this Parliament for 19 years in a variety of ministerial roles. Joe was fearless in standing up for every single minority group and for everybody in our city. He was also a relentless campaigner, and I am indebted to him and the phenomenal SNP team who work tirelessly every day to make sure that Dundee continues to be the yes city. Presiding Officer, Dundee is not just a city of discovery, it is a city of relentless resilience. Within my lifetime, Dundee survived the demise of the global jute trade. We then reinvented ourselves with Timex and NCR before watches and tills became digital. Undeterred, we then became a global digital powerhouse with the gaming industry, with Rockstar Games and in the city and Abertay University ranked the top international school for video game design. Dundee University is leading in life sciences and drug discovery, and with Dundee and Angus College, we have 3 world-class higher education institutions, all of which must be cherished. Our waterfront proudly showcases the V&A. Dundee Rep and DCA are internationally recognised. Livehouse, a newcomer on the scene, is doing great, and we hope to welcome Eden to their Scottish home very soon. Presiding Officer, I'm now going to focus on Dundee's role in the energy transition and the need for us to have power over our own energy. As colleagues in the chamber know, and has been said today, Scotland won the energy lottery twice, not just with all that oil and gas we were told ran out in 2014, but with the huge potential of renewable energy generated here due to our geology, our climate and our highly skilled workforce. Scotland is an energy-rich nation, which should mean energy-rich Scots, but instead too many Dundonians are living with no route out of fuel poverty. Labour promised £300 off fuel bills, but we're realising they're now going to be £600 worse off.
The Ofgem 13% increase in the energy cap will put a load more people into fuel poverty. Presiding Officer, I'm passionate about ensuring that we get the energy to work for the benefit of the people who live here. I'm proud to be the Deputy Chair of the Dundee Climate Leadership Group, a pioneering group bringing together the utility companies, the NHS, our universities and college, the council, the housing sector and the third sector in Dundee. The Dundee Climate Leadership Group have developed detailed plans for the phased introduction of decarbonised district heating across the city. We're keen to get on with the transition. And, Presiding Officer, if you're going to do district heating at scale anywhere in Scotland, do it in Dundee. We're built for it. We're a compact, densely populated area of land, 150,000 people living on 25 square miles on a south-facing slope. Don't just think of Desperate Dan when you think of Dundee. Think, well, that's Dundee, we're the day the district heating. We know that if we're to deliver this scale of infrastructure investment, we need collaboration, expertise and sound governance over decades. We know we must attract private investment, and that requires the business case to add up. But right now, the market is rigged against renewables, and we don't have any power to do anything about that. It's increasingly clear that if we want to ensure that the price of energy is protected and affordable for the future citizens of Dundee and Scotland, we need power over our own energy system. It's not enough to generate the energy. We need to have the power over the distribution of the energy, the upgrading of the grid, the unit cost, the tariffs, the taxes applied to the bill and the pricing mechanisms. Presiding Officer, at present we have all the energy but none of the powers. As a former member of the European Parliament, I know what powerlessness feels like. Scotland, a proud European nation, had no powers to prevent us being dragged out of Europe against our will and without our consent. Europe knew it too. That's why they sang Auld Lang Syne when we left. We know what it feels like to send £400 billion worth of oil and gas wealth to Westminster and be left paying the highest energy bills in Europe and watch our pensioners lose their winter heating payments. We know what it feels like to repeatedly elect independence-supporting governments and have our democracy denied. But take heart. Supporters of independence, like Dundonians, are relentlessly resilient. We will never give up fighting for what we believe in. We know that Scotland will thrive as an independent nation. We know that Scotland will take her seat back at the heart of Europe where she belongs. We know that the energy wealth of Scotland will benefit the people of Scotland. And the people who just voted for the largest number of independent support in MSPs to this Parliament know it too. And that's why they won't be silenced. Presiding Officer, I strongly support the motion and look forward to the day when Scotland has both the energy and the power to ensure that Scotland's resources benefit the people of Scotland. Thank you.
Making their first speech, I call Christopher Leask, to be followed by Alan Brown.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I congratulate yourself and the Minister on your appointments. I look forward to working together. I am unashamedly a product of our renewable energy story in Scotland and specifically at home in Orkney. It's what's led me to this Parliament and it's what drives me to make change for my community and my region, the Highlands and Islands. So I'm very pleased to be making my first speech on a topic so close to my heart. All too often, when we talk about our national transition to renewable energy, we focus purely on jobs and the economic impact. We forget that this is not only the economic opportunity of our time, but it's our chance to build thriving, sustainable communities in areas which desperately need investment. Those communities are located right across Scotland, but particularly in my own region, the Highlands and Islands. Orkney has been a trailblazer in community-owned energy for decades now. This stretches back to the Westry Development Trust well over 20 years ago. However, the outlook for community energy in Scotland now is challenging. In the context of successive UK governments which have failed to plan for our future energy system, seem perpetually stuck in reforming our grid system to no conclusion, the challenge is undoubtable. But the Scottish Government too must be serious about delivering on their own existing commitments. We need a credible roadmap to significant expansion of renewable energy owned by Scotland's communities. Equally, we need to be honest about what we have achieved toward that goal so far. For years now, the Scottish Government target of 2 megawatts by 2030 has conflated community-owned energy and locally owned energy, the latter of which includes those owned by private businesses and large estates. Together, these account for an encouraging 1.15 gigawatts, but only 113 megawatts of this is truly community-owned energy. Progress at this rate is too slow. And we already have the power to make faster progress by prioritising public land for community developments, getting ahead of the first generation of mass significant repowering of private onshore wind, which is already starting. And herein lie opportunities for the Scottish Government to work with us, to make progress that we can make, that we already can and should begin. And nowhere more so, however, have I seen the positive impact firsthand that our development of renewable energy is having on the communities driving it forward, the marine energy in Orkney. I've been incredibly fortunate in my life so far to benefit from not only the knowledge economy we've built in Orkney on renewables and decarbonisation, but the people it's brought into my life. Friends and mentors that now call Orkney home and have helped create an international, outward-looking community. Our island communities, even more acutely than the rest of Scotland, face enormous demographic and population challenges. To remain the viable, thriving and culturally rich places they are, we must recognise them in this Parliament as drivers of our energy transition. That's why I'm proud to have stood in a manifesto that is ambitious for the renewable energy sector and our communities. We must commit to leading the world in areas like tidal stream and floating offshore wind testing. That same national opportunity now sits in front of us. Deep water floating wind test facilities in Orkney, the commercialisation and deployment of tidal stream, and further developing our supply chain found across the country. 300 megawatts of tidal stream project capacity await us in Orkney and the Pentland Firth alone, and it's built upon a 50% Scottish supply chain. A clear national success story that this government needs to get behind. And I say to them, work with us to deliver this. It's time we deliver a sectoral policy plan for tidal energy. Communities like Orkney and our role in the transition to renewable energy tell the story of modern Scotland. It points to where we need to go. Our transition to renewable energy is a challenge, yes, but it's undoubtedly our greatest opportunity. We must unashamedly pursue this, and we must do so together. We can also take action on what we can do now. We must begin doing that. It's on here to grasp the opportunity in front of us, and I'm keen the Minister is keen to work together. Thank you.
I call on Alan Brown to make their first speech, which will be followed by closing speeches. Thank you.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's the honour of my life to represent Kilmarnock Arden Valley in this Parliament, the one that is answerable to the people of Scotland. Now, I've grown up in Arden Valley and I've always called it my home. There's such a wonderful mix of different communities in the constituency. Now, Presiding Officer, many of us here were here because of the votes cast for us. That's what gets us here. But also many of us are here thanks to Alexander Fleming of Darvo, who discovered penicillin in 1928, has been responsible for saving some 200 to 500 million lives. So you're all welcome. It was while staying with Reverend Laurie of Newmilns that Robert Burns decided not to continue his journey to Greenock and then emigration. So again, you are welcome that our famous bard was able to stay and give us the poems and the humanitarian stuff that we all love and appreciate. The oldest cooperative in the world was founded in Fenwick, small village in my constituency. Of course, for Kilmarnock, long one of the beating heart, industrial hearts of Scotland, proud locomotive, carpet industry. Glad to see Brodie Engineering continuing that railway heritage, and of course home of Johnny Walker. Not just that, home of Kilmarnock FC, the most successful non-city club in Scotland. And Kilmarnock FC takes me to my predecessor, Willie Coffey, who I'd like to pay tribute to. It was Willie who first taught me never to take no for an answer for a constituent and constituent casework. Always fight to get the result you want. And I hope to also repeat that work ethic and repay the faith that the voters have put in me. And I pay tribute to Willie for what he did beforehand. Presiding Officer, I should say, I know it's my first speech, but because I intervene in other people, I'd be willing to consider an intervention if there's enough time. But, Presiding Officer, unionists that try to decry us with the cliché phrase of grievance politics. But truthfully, when it comes to energy, we've got a right to have some grievances the way Westminster's mishandled our resources. Let's start with the 1974 Macron report. It was stamped secret and hidden for 31 years. Now, it was that report that confirmed that if Scotland was independent, our currency would become the hardest in Europe, with the exception perhaps of the Norwegian krone. Confirmed there would be an influx of foreign funds to Scotland and would have an embarrassing budget surplus. What a betrayal. All these years after that, telling us oil was running out, we're too poor to be independent, while knowing full well the opportunities that were there for Scotland, and they buried that information. Now, the next betrayal is what we've heard about today, the squandering of the resources they knew that was coming and flowing to the Treasury. We could have had a sovereign wealth fund akin to Norway, whose $2.2 trillion fund is the largest in the world. So where has the money gone? Lost in Thatcher's tax cuts, funding infrastructure such as M25, HS1, the Channel Tunnel, not the dualling of the A9 or the A96, nor the construction of the Aberdeen bypass, all left to the SNP to deliver, and no thoughts of a wider reindustrialisation strategy that would have benefited my constituency of Kilmarnock over the years. Now, betrayal 3 is the lack of support for carbon capture in the North East, despite Acorn being vital to the transition of oil and gas workers and the decarbonisation of Peterhead Power Station. It was 2015 that Osborne pulled the £1 billion funding competition that Acorn was about to win. Now, we're 11 years on, there's £22 billion committed to the clusters in the north of England, but Acorn still waits in the £200 million promised by the UK Government. Somehow we're meant to be grateful for £200 million, 1,000th the funding given to the English clusters. Presiding Officer, of course, it's not just hydrocarbons. Scotland is rich in renewables, onshore, offshore and floating wind, as well as marine energy. We're a net exporter of electricity, despite the grid charging system that penalises generation in Scotland. Generators in the south of England get paid to connect to the grid, but we have to pay resulting in additional costs of up to £1 billion for offshore projects to the north of Scotland. The system has required change for decades, but it's been ignored by Westminster. And it's ironic that members in here have been complaining about the grid upgrades that are still required, as if somehow it's Scotland's fault, as if somehow we can't do it, when it's all these years with a lack of planning from Westminster has led us to this. Complaining about constraint payments. The constraint payments are because the grid's not been upgraded or planned for all these years. Presiding Officer, if I move on to another type of energy, marine energy. We are world leaders in tidal stream energy, with MyGen being the largest operational development in the world. And yet this sector also lacks long-term financial support from the UK Government. With control of energy, Scotland could develop 4.3 gigawatts of tidal stream and the same again in wave energy, creating an £8.7 billion GVA opportunity, according to Edinburgh University. Now, Presiding Officer, onshore wind deployment has been a success story for Scotland, but we lost out on the chance to be early leaders and manufacturers for onshore wind due to a lack of UK Government ambition. We cannot and we must not miss out on these world-first opportunities for marine energy. Now, marine energy hits a technology that gives predictable baseload to supplement the intermittency of renewables. And another renewable technology suited to grid balancing is pumped storage hydro. Now, it's taken long enough to get a cap and floor pricing mechanism agreed, but now that this mechanism is there in principle, it must be awarded to several of the schemes ready to go in Scotland, starting with Corrie Glass, which was first granted planned permission in 2013. So we've had years of lost opportunity regards construction jobs, long-term energy security and balancing. Indeed, Presiding Officer, as we know, because Scotland is not in control of these policies, too much of the UK energy focus instead has been spent in the procurement of new nuclear, and we've heard that again from the Unionist parties in here today. It's a technology that is ridiculously expensive, takes about 15 years to deliver. I said earlier that Hinkley Point C station is now estimated at £50 billion, not forgetting originally it was estimated at £18 billion in 2016, and somehow Starmer has signed us up for the same again for Sizewell C, and I'll take an intervention.
Yes, thank you, Presiding Officer. The member did say he would take an intervention, so it was just one on nuclear there. I just would like to point out that South Korea has built 8 nuclear reactors at the cost of $5 to $6 billion each, with an average construction time of 8.5 years. So I would just like the member's opinion on that.
Well, I'll draw them to research that shows out of 180 nuclear stations that were researched, 175 of them come in at double the cost, and on average took 64% longer time to build than was predicted. So I don't take his isolated information.
Could you wind up, please, Mr. Glenn?
Now, this is money which should have been allocated to the renewable supply chain for development and for energy efficiency measures to tackle fuel poverty. It does beg our belief that energy-rich Scotland has people living in fuel poverty while paying some of the highest energy bills in Europe. Zonal pricing was an option that could maybe bring down bills, but that was immediately ruled out by Westminster because it might increase bills in the south east of England, who already have lower bills. But no, we couldn't have any impact in the south east of England, the richest area in the UK. So, Presiding Officer, it is clear that Westminster does not develop energy policies with Scotland in mind. We should feel the benefit of being a net exporter of oil, gas and electricity, yet we know our bills are up once again. So it is time that Scotland's energy is in Scotland's hands, so our resources work for the people of Scotland.
We now move to the first of the closing speeches, which is also a first contribution, and I call Sana Dykstra Downey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and congratulations on your election too. It is a profound honour to stand here as the MSP for the new constituency of Edinburgh Northern. I'd like to pay tribute to my 3 predecessors, Angus Robertson, Alex Cole-Hamilton and Ben McPherson, who I congratulate on his ministerial position. I'm conscious of my responsibility to build on their good work, and I'm grateful to them for their words of support and guidance to me. Edinburgh Northern is a compact constituency. As you would expect of somebody with a Dutch background, I can cycle from one corner to another in 27 minutes, and I often do. My route takes me along a beautifully rewilded former railway network, and the Roseburn Pass stacks up against any cycling route in the country. Within such a tight geography, the constituency is made up of many different communities, each with a distinct character, history and identity. There's the centuries-old coastal community of Newhaven Village with the best fish and chips in the city, just minutes away from brand new developments on the Granton waterfront. There's vibrant high streets in Stockbridge and Davidson's Mains, residential communities such as Trinity, Powderhall, Bonington, Granton, Pilton, Muirhouse, Drylaw, Silvernouse, Craigleith, Blackhall, each with a deep sense of their own identity, their own much-loved green and blue spaces, and dedicated local organisations that enhance the lives of the people living there. It is where I have built a life, raised a family, and found a community. And one thing that unites all of these communities is the energy that powers its people's lives. So, permit me to forget about Scotland's energy for a minute. What does energy mean for the people of North Edinburgh? As a councillor and a candidate, I have spoken to thousands of people across the constituency over the past 4 years, and it's a lot of things. Energy is, on any chilly day, making decisions about whether to buy food or heat your cold, drafty home. You keep your windows firmly shut to waste no heat, but then end up with mould on your walls. The mould makes your children sick, and their persistent cough means they miss school. That is energy. Energy might mean that you worry about your family's bills rising sharply because of conflicts far from our shores, but with impacts felt in our homes. It might mean putting off important financial decisions or forgoing things that in your life that you value and enjoy. Or it might be your business that is struggling to keep up with rising production costs. It might be a young person who wants to go to Edinburgh College to become a heat pump installer, but can't get a place to study because there is not enough money in further education to meet the demand of places. Energy is also the Grantham Waterfront heat network plans falling apart at the 11th hour because the cost of electricity is so high that it is difficult to make the numbers stack up. But energy is also the P7s in Wardy and Blackhall primary schools who spoke to me about how they would design the city of the future. Some of their ideas were a little bit outlandish. I remember they had a real thing for living underground. But their love for the environment and their enthusiasm for innovative clean energy gave me immense hope for the future. Energy is also working together as neighbours to produce your own renewable energy. Groups like the Dudley Eco-Community, who are collectively navigating the planning system to add solar panels and heat pumps to homes within a conservation area, because they want to play their part in reducing our carbon emissions. All of these things are what energy means to the people of Edinburgh Northern, and as their MSP, it is my responsibility and my privilege to help find ways to address the issues that they face. This is why the Liberal Democrats want to insulate cold homes with an emergency home insulation programme and help the most vulnerable households with their fuel bills. It's why we want to see an expansion of renewable energy to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and reform community benefits, as my colleague Liam MacArthur has highlighted, so that communities truly benefit from projects on their doorstep. It's why we want to protect funding for colleges, as we did in the last Scottish budget, to make sure that young people can gain the skills they need to get good green jobs, and that our society needs for a just transition to an economy that does not rely on fossil fuels. It's why we want the UK government to follow through on a full decoupling of electricity prices from the expensive and volatile gas prices, so that heat pumps, heat networks and other electrified heating and transport options are feasible and affordable. And it's why we want to remove barriers for microgeneration and community energy projects, so that more renewable energy is generated near to where it is used. Presiding Officer, I will work with this government with passion and, yes, with positive energy, to use the powers already within our possession to deliver for the people of Edinburgh Northern. Thank you.
Call Murdo Fraser, to be followed by Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by thanking all those who made their first speeches during this debate? Duncan Massey, Jack Middleton, David Barrett, Mark Simpson, Pauline Stafford, Heather Anderson, Christopher Lees, Alan Brown and Sani Dijkstra Downey. All of them very well informed, helpful contributions, a very wide variety of different opinions we heard, but that's as it should be in a parliament like this. I don't think I want to single anybody out particularly, but I would just say to my fellow Fife representative David Barrett, I very much enjoyed his contribution, although I was absolutely horrified at the revelation that he first visited this building as a primary school pupil. Yeah. It just makes some of us feel very old, Presiding Officer. Thank you for that sedentary contribution, Mr Barrett. We do, of course, miss both Ewings. I hope you'll be equally independently minded when it comes to your front bench, Mr Barrett. Now, to go back to Mr Gethin's open this debate, and I again congratulate him on his new role. And I welcomed the confident delivery of a speech, so confident I omitted to realise it was his first speech in this debate. But I have to agree with Daniel Johnson's analysis, because although good on delivery, his speech in terms of content was simply pie in the sky and lacked any credible detail. Because Scotland has seen massive investment in energy in recent decades, particularly in the renewable space, with the construction of a huge range of offshore wind projects, creating jobs and helping with our energy security. But that's only possible because that investment is supported by the generous UK-wide subsidy regime, funded by the bill payments of 70 million consumers across the United Kingdom. And that simple fact exposes the fallacy at the heart of SNP policy. It's the UK single energy market that supports investment in industry, and breaking that up would be a disaster. And I thought perhaps there was a wry smile on Mr Gethin's lips when he accused others in this chamber of being isolationist. It's not us who are proposing breaking up the UK energy market and splitting away. It's Mr Gethin's and his colleagues. And, of course, the SNP claim that independence would reduce energy bills by 1/3. But no explanation from the Minister as to how that's going to come about, because, in fact, independence would increase energy costs. And the reason for that is because, despite what we sometimes hear to the contrary from the SNP benches, renewable energy is not cheap. The most recent Contracts for Difference round showed that the cost of offshore wind projects, the most significant area of expansion we've seen in Scotland in recent years, I will in a second, is now set at nearly double the wholesale cost of gas. And that's before we factor in all the additional costs that renewable energy brings. I'll give way to Lorna Slater.
Ms Slater.
Does the member accept that any oil and gas costs must include the cost of sequestering that carbon later? Because we cannot consider emitting carbon without reabsorbing it, or else we face catastrophic global warming.
Well, the problem for Lorna Slater and those who make the arguments that she does is that we will need oil and gas for decades to come. And the choice is not whether or not we use oil and gas, because we will need it. The choice is, do we produce it here, or do we import it from other countries and therefore export our carbon emissions to them? And to me, that makes no sense. We should have the jobs right here in Scotland. But Duncan Massey made some good points in terms of the cost of renewable energy, because it's not just the strike price and the subsidy we have to look at. We have to look at the on-costs that arise from developing renewables. Our grid needs to be upgraded. SSE in Perth are investing tens of billions of pounds in grid expansion to accommodate new renewable projects, to deal with the issues we've been talking about today about constraint payments. But every single one of the pounds we are spending on that is coming from the bill payers across the United Kingdom and adding to fuel poverty. And because renewable energy is intermittent, we have to be able to provide storage and backup. That's why we see all these battery projects being proposed right across Scotland. Every single one has to be paid for on our electricity bills. SSE, as Alan Brown said, are progressing a massive pump storage project at Corrie Glass in the Highlands at the cost of billions of pounds. Who's paying that? Our energy bills. And all these costs of transmission, of storage and of backup for intermittency have to be factored in, and that gives us what energy economists call the whole system cost. And the whole system cost of renewable energy is many times higher than the whole system cost of oil and gas. Now, there might be good reasons to decarbonise our energy supply, I accept that, but let's not kid ourselves. That's going to reduce our bills. It's not going to reduce our bills, it's going to make them more expensive. And the only reason we can do this is because of those 70 million people across the United Kingdom paying their energy bills. If the cost had to be shared between 5.5 million people in Scotland, bills would rocket. And the second issue we need to address, Presiding Officer, is the future of oil and gas. Because Scotland has lost 3 oil and gas jobs for every 1 clean energy job created over the past decade. A recent report from Robert Gordon University suggests the number of oil and gas jobs could halve by 2030 to 60,000, a direct result of the policy being pursued by the UK Labour government and backed up by the SNP here in Scotland. And the SNP now say they're against the Energy Profits Levy. Well, of course, at the time the Energy Profits Levy was introduced, the SNP were saying it wasn't high enough. They were calling for it to go even higher. And now, fortunately, they seem to have changed their tune, I think, and they're agreeing with us, and they're now saying EPL needs to go, and they're right to do so. But the SNP are no friends of the oil and gas sector. Nicola Sturgeon, when she was First Minister, called for the presumption against oil and gas to be formalised. She was clear that new fossil fuel developments were not in the interests of either the climate or the North Sea workforce. And Labour and SNP in this respect are cut from the same cloth. Now, we know that Mr Flynn might take a different view, but the view of the Scottish Government, consistently repeated, is that they have a presumption against new oil and gas fields. They are no friends to the oil and gas sector. No. And that, presiding officer, flies in the face of Scottish public opinion, because according to recent surveys, 84% of Scots support the continuation of North Sea oil exploration and drilling, and no wonder. And as Liam Kerr said earlier, where is the sense in importing Norwegian oil and gas from the North Sea basin when we could be producing it ourselves and getting the benefit of the jobs here, presiding officer? So that's the Conservative approach. That's how we cut bills. That's how we support jobs. That's the point made in Liam Kerr's amendment, and that's why the Chamber should support it. Thank you.
Thank you. I call on Patrick Harvey. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm happy to have the first chance on the record to congratulate you and the Deputy Presiding Officers on your appointment, and congratulations to the Minister on his appointment. I hope he enjoys over the next few years being constructively pushed out of his comfort zone, because it's clearly going to be needed. And can I congratulate most of those who gave their first speeches today, at least those who chose to engage with the reality of a world in climate crisis. Not all chose to do that. I'll pick out just one in particular, Heather Anderson, who spoke about a clear example of climate action in her own community, in the development of heat networks. And I suspect every MSP in every part of Scotland will be able to find examples where climate action is improving people's lives if we choose to look for them rather than turning away. Presiding Officer, I am well used in this chamber to disagreeing with other parties on matters of policy, in particular with those who are happy to set climate targets and then block climate action. And it's pretty clear from today's debate that that dynamic will continue. But we also face a new dynamic in this chamber, where we are not only going to disagree on matters of policy, but we are going to disagree on matters of fundamental reality. In the election that's just finished, I heard candidates say things like, carbon dioxide isn't a problem, really. Climate change is caused by the sun. CO2 is plant food. And just literally, there is no climate crisis. This drivel from the far-right blogosphere and the junk tanks is now clearly going to be heard in our Parliament as well. But, Presiding Officer, it's not only in this Parliament, and I think it's less in this Parliament where we need to worry about its effect, because this kind of online conspiracy and propaganda, amplified by AI slop and pumped out by billionaire-funded media platforms, this is now the information environment in which many of our citizens are living. And if the Scottish Government wants to make any progress at all on climate, it is going to need to develop a robust response to the wave of disinformation and conspiracy theories that are growing. In terms of the impact, though, the real worry that I have in this session of Parliament is not so much that these climate denial arguments will win the day in Parliament, but that the impact on the SNP, who know already that they have a climate plan that isn't up to the task, is that the real danger is that they are going to feel that they can play the next 5 years on easy mode. All they will need to do is say climate change is real, and by comparison with this lot, they're going to look as though they're leaders, even as some of their own parliamentarians echo the drill baby drill mantra of the far right. And I want to remind the SNP that the high point of their popularity came when they previously gave clarity and leadership, when Nicola Sturgeon made climate a priority and made it clear that Rosebank should not go ahead. By contrast, their lack of clarity now, whilst demanding energy powers but refusing still to publish an energy strategy, and their desire to face both ways on climate leadership while sounding like oil and gas lobbyists. This will not stand. Greens want powers on energy, but we want them for a purpose. In relation to Jackdaw and Rosebank, let me remind the Chamber, would produce over 200 million tonnes of CO2. 200 million tonnes, that's more than the combined annual emissions of 28 of the lowest income countries in the world, more than the annual emissions created by 700 million people. those people who have done the least to cause the climate crisis, but who are already suffering its effects the most. I give way.
I'm grateful, but presumably the member would acknowledge that the emissions from any oil and gas taken from the North Sea are 3 times less than that imported from places like Qatar.
I've seen a huge amount of disinformation about the comparative emissions associated, but I also know that the vast majority of what would come from Rosebank would be exported anyway. And the UK public would be carrying around 90% of the cost of developing Rosebank through subsidies and tax breaks. The profits, though, would go to the oil and gas giants who make nothing more than a token investment in the transition, including one which is directly complicit in illegal Israeli settlements in occupied Palestine. Supporting this would make a mockery of the SNP's backing for boycott, divestment and sanctions. And like every other fossil fuel company currently laying people off, we know that they will abandon communities and workers as soon as the profits dry up. So I challenge the SNP to accept the reality on those projects and why they should not be given the go-ahead. Whatever energy policy the SNP does finally adopt, though, Scotland's energy in Scotland's hands has to mean more than just bringing decision-making powers here. It means ending the assumption that the entire system remains actually in the hands of big business. Christopher Leask spoke clearly about the opportunity for more community ownership of energy, and this is something where we need to catch up with our European neighbours. Presiding Officer, ending our reliance on fossil fuel is urgent. It's an urgent response to the climate crisis itself, cutting our emissions in heat and transport as we've done in electricity generation, but it's also the only coherent, credible way to cut the cost of living, freeing people from the continual cycle of fossil fuel price hikes and crises, and it's the only way to achieve credible energy security and national security, because every step we take toward decarbonisation takes geopolitical power away from some of the world's most dangerous and violent regimes.
I was a bit lax with you there, I have to say, Mr Harvey, but obviously that's taking time from other members, so please try and keep within your time. Plus that you accepted for interventions, you're still considerably over. Mr Offord.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and may I
3 minutes.
3 minutes, yeah. By welcoming Mr Gethin to his place on the front bench. Nice to see another refugee from Westminster. Look, I think we can all agree in this chamber that we've got ourselves in a mess on energy. And my colleague here, Duncan Massey, gave a very eloquent description of that, where we've got the highest energy prices in the OECD, with only less than 1% of global emissions. Now, of course, net zero was conceived by Labour in 2008. It has now been doubled down by Ed Miliband since 2024. But the real damage on this was done to us by the Conservative Party. 14 years of mismanagement of the energy system, and that's one of the two main reasons why I left the Conservative Party. Because writing net zero into law in 70 minutes in a Commons debate with no vote, and imposing EPLs on in the last budget from Jeremy Hunt in maintaining the EPL demonstrates that, frankly, the Conservative Party cannot be trusted on energy. Now, what has been the impact of net zero policies? The result is, as discussed by Mr Massey, we've had terrible deindustrialisation in Scotland, which has blighted our communities and blighted our towns. I'll take that intervention.
It was to remind Lord Offord that his manifesto called for the end of all subsidies to the renewables sector. So I just wondered if he's had a Damascene conversion because he's talking about deindustrialisation, or does he still believe that those workers and those job opportunities should be put on the scrap heap?
Delighted to answer that, because that is actually going to be the last minute of my 1 minute left. The result is that we've had massive deindustrialisation, which has really blighted our towns and communities across Scotland. Yes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'd like to thank Malcolm for giving way. We have both witnessed first-hand the impact on our communities in Fife, with the closure of Mossmorton's Fife ethylene plant and its 400 job losses. And this was due to bad policy choices. So, does he share my concerns with the proposed large data centre in Octortool, as this will create nowhere near the amount of job losses that we've seen at Mossmore, and this will create no more. So I'd like to know...
Well, that's enough for an intervention. It's not a speech within a speech.
I agree with Julie McDougall. This is the classic example of how ideology is put in front of people. And the reality is that this renewables is a big, fat racket. And let me explain why. They first came to our shores 30 years ago and were given, I'm going to talk about exactly that, given 15-year subsidies on the basis that they are like a child, grows into adolescent, becomes an adult, and needs to be nurtured and will mature into merchant viable. 15 years ago, they were given another 15 years of subsidies. And in February this year, they were given 20 more years of subsidies. 50 years of subsidies to what is meant to be the cheapest part of our electricity system. And all the jobs that come with it, which the OE UK are saying are less than half of the transition from hydrocarbon to renewables, and at less than half of the salaries. And here's the thing that I think Mr Lewis needs to be reminded of, is that this is the biggest transfer of money from poor people to rich people in our generation. And if you're proud of that, and you're proud of that industry, if you're proud of what that is based on, feel free. But the reality is that is not helping the people of Scotland, where 2/3 of domestic bills are paying for subsidies for so-called just transition. So the reality is that net stupid zero is actually the biggest act of self-harm in a generation. And what we need to do here is take the ideology out of this. Can we just all grow up and be intelligent about this? Can we just agree we want a balanced scorecard, that our obligation is first and foremost to our people is to get our energy prices down, to allow people to heat their homes and allow them to increase their productivity. And if we can do that, we will have oil and gas, of course. That needs to be the bedrock. That should be our transition fuel. And if in time renewables become viable and merchant viable, they can be at the table as well. But we need to build prosperity. And in that case, I cannot back this motion.
Thank you. Michael Mara, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm going to dispense with further sickly warm words for the Minister. Perhaps like us, Mr Giffins is all getting a little bit old. But I have to say that I very much enjoyed the many new members' speeches today. Can I make particular mention of Heather Anderson? The more Dundee, the better. And I'm sure she'll be a mighty advocate for God's gift to Scotland. The debate has come down to the future of the subsidy regime, and should that be spread across 70 million taxpayers or across 5.5 million? And the validity of the government's motion really does rest on that question above all others. And that subsidy regime, whether the contract for difference or its predecessor, the renewable obligation certificates, a more direct subsidy from taxpayers to the transition, is the cost of the hugely challenging but necessary energy transition, and it is being socialised across the whole of the UK. But unfortunately, the sloganeering of the election has given way to the sloganeering of the motion today. And I would say to the Minister that he is absolutely right to raise the issue and to campaign on the price of energy. But the promise of a one-third cut in prices under independence is frankly to exploit them, to exploit those concerns. The Minister was completely unable to justify those claims. I hope in closing he might be able to do so. I asked him in his initial speech. It would be good if he could have actually an attempt in closing. We know that the strike price has been higher than the wholesale electricity costs for other than for a very brief period during the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So how can he justify this position in all but his imagination? And the answer can't be zonal pricing. Unfortunately, I would say to Mr Brown, again, a fine opening speech, and I do forgive him for not knowing that the ministers had ruled out zonal pricing. It had to be wrung out of them like blood from a stone to actually take a position after a period of months, but ruled out it was. And it was because of the devastating impact it would have on our renewables industry in Scotland. We are acutely aware, I think, across this chamber of the challenge to households and to industry, and we really do need a serious plan that's in very difficult times when the global price shocks are frequent and a constrained fiscal environment does make long-term decision-making increasingly challenging. I would say that we on these benches completely reject the climate denialism of reform, which we've heard now in a couple of speeches. Not at the moment, Mr Massey, but man-made and human-made climate change is real and it is devastating communities across the world. It's driving resource competition and actually is one of the key causes of migration, of which his party is so obsessed. North East communities are acutely aware in the crumbling... No, thank you, Mr Kerr. North East communities are acutely aware, whether it be in the crumbling sandstone of Dundee or the displaced people of Brecon, about the impact of climate change in this country. It needs a solution and it needs one urgently. Yes, I'll take that point.
I'm grateful to the member for giving way. Can I invite him, in that case, to condemn the contribution that's been made in recent days by Tony Blair, calling for the abolition of net zero policies, and encourage the Cabinet to give him short shrift?
Well, I would say I've not read the piece from Tony Blair, but I would say what I have read, surely not, what I have read of it I didn't like, so I can leave that for Mr Harvey. Perhaps we can compare notes on it. But I would say, if I can come back to Mr Massey's contribution, no, not at the moment. His point on Spain, I thought, was well made, but I would take it a step further. He made the point about over-reliance on intermittent capacity, but Spain's system failed because of frequency regulation, and that was the inability to maintain a 50 Hz current that regular turns of a turbine actually allow. So what that does tell us is that we require a diverse energy mix. France turned off the supply from Spain in 1.5 seconds because of how vulnerable it made their economy and their households. We need a diverse energy mix that is required beyond questions of supply, capacity and base load capacity. And that requires a properly integrated system across the UK that does include nuclear, and there is no answer for our need for that crucial base load capacity. We have to make sure and must retain our long-term position as an energy powerhouse in Europe and the UK, as pointed out so well by my colleague Paul Sweeney, and quoting Sir Donald Miller about the lack of a plan to replace our generation capacity. In his words, it is incomprehensible. And that supply has to be secure. I found the Minister's points on security of supply inside Europe, but outside of the UK, difficult to follow. We know that... Well, I'll tell you why. We know that a defence priority must be our North Sea assets, which only in recent weeks has seen Russian submarines threatening cabling. The extraction of Scotland from the UK defence capacity would require those socialised costs, further costs, to have to be met at a time when investment must increase rather than decrease. So that partnership across these islands is, presiding officer, a difficult one. It is a generational challenge, and it requires a calm, reasoned dialogue front bench that is based on realistic analysis. And I know that Michael Shanks, the UK Energy Minister and the MP for Rutherglen, has really valued the constructive engagement he's had with Gillian Martin, the Minister's predecessor, in trying to build some of that consensus of work. I'm sure he can anticipate further collaboration with the Minister, Stephen Gethins, but this motion doesn't get it off to a great start.
Thank you. To wind up the debate, the Calling Minister Stephen Gethins, 9 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and because I didn't have the opportunity earlier on, I welcome you to your place. It's good to see you. I also once again move the motion. What I'm going to try and do is, first, I thank colleagues for engaging in today's debate, and I'd like to congratulate all those members who have made, like me, made a first-time speech today, and I'm going to tackle as many of those one by one as I possibly can. We were opened with Daniel Johnson. It was such a pity to hear the Labour Party talk about devolution in terms, and this is fundamentally what this is about, where these powers sit, as being an incoherent motion. This is a straightforward motion about the best place for these powers to lie. And I'm not going to take the member at the moment, but I thought that was a huge pity. And he started talking about issues of consent. We've doubled the capacity. He started talking about grid capacity. I'd encourage him to have a chat with his colleagues down the road as well. I will engage with them positively, and I would encourage him to do the same thing. However, he was fortunate, very fortunate, in that he was followed by Duncan Massey. Now, whereas I consider that I'll congratulate the honourable member being in his place, can I say...
Honourable member?
Honourable member. Forgive me, Presiding Officer. you put me in the First Minister's bad books now, Presiding Officer. I congratulate the member, but there's a serious point here. It takes some courage to be a North East MSP and call for an end to net zero, which a report only yesterday says supports 105,000 jobs, many of them in the area that he represents and that I represent. And let me tell him this, and he can sit down and listen for a moment. The CBI report yesterday said in Aberdeen City, 9.4% gross value added from net zero and 12.7% of jobs in that fine granite city. And I'm delighted that we've got a member for Aberdeen South who will stand up for those kind of jobs and that kind of economy. And I'm going to let him in on this. To describe climate change as being on faith-based
Mr Massey, stay seated until you're called by the member to take an intervention.
Faith-based terms is a scandal, and nobody else in this Parliament should stand for that kind of nonsense. And I'll give way to him on that.
Mr Massey.
First of all, to the dishonourable member, I would say...
No, I don't think you can say that either. Come on.
I would say my speech was very, very clear. I acknowledged climate change. I acknowledged the IPCC. What I said was climate emergency is not a term used in the scientific consensus. Going back to your earlier points about the report from the CBI, that has now been stated that they do not support that because it was done by a separate consultancy, and they do not support that report. But what I would ask you directly is, can you stand up and back Jackdaw and Rosebank and new drilling and new licences?
Without Can I make an intervention?
It's an intervention. As I said to one of your colleagues, it's not speeches within speeches, Minister.
I thank you. I thank you for the opportunity to make the intervention. There are 105,000 jobs that rely on it, his constituents that rely on it, our constituents that rely on it. There is a place for renewables. Yes, there's a place for the other industries as well, but those are jobs that we back. Richard Tice said we would strike down all contracts, putting people out of work, people out of good jobs. Now, Lorna Slater was right to call that out. She was absolutely right to call it out. I did talk about it being a finite resource, but did not have that long-term benefit. From Liam Kerr, maybe less said about the better, complaining about constraints payments in the UK market whilst turning us away from a pan-European market at the same time. I'll try and be more generous to Liam MacArthur and his ongoing commitment to community benefit and taking that seriously. Yes, I want to work with Liam MacArthur, and Christopher Leask also made a very good point, and I've also had Hannah Mary in my ear as well about Shetland, as I know others will be, about making sure this benefit is felt across Scotland. Now, in terms, and I won't, but I recognise that the member will make the case for Nahalin and Inyar as well, and I recognise that and the benefits that need to go there. Jack Middleton, what an outstanding advocate for Aberdeen Central. What an outstanding advocate. And his thanks for Kevin Stewart, the poverty challenge, highlighting the sanctions on Russia and where Norway, independent Norway, has been able to go. Paul Sweeney, I thought that was quite courageous as well in terms of talking about Ming Yang, constraints payments as well. I would encourage you to take up some of these issues with the UK Government. Karen Adam, you're right. This is not a theoretical debate for your constituents, and you were right to highlight that, quite right to highlight that. I'm not going to at the moment, and it's how can communities afford to heat their homes. David Barrett brings his professional experience, and the people of Fife and Cowdenbeath...
We're over here, Minister.
...to have him here. Sorry?
Looking through the chair. Stop turning your
Presiding
back to the
officer,
chair.
David Barrett, the people of Cowdenbeath, I'm sure you'll agree, are lucky to have him here, but he's also right in terms of the lessons of energy boom and decline as well. Mark Simpson, stop renewables. Well, lucky you trying to get that message across in North East Scotland as well. And I'll tell you something else. He talks about immigration. Well, I'm happy talking about issues reserved to Westminster here. Crossing the Channel, the boats. These were numbers that I got that exploded when the UK left the Dublin Convention, that exploded as a result of Brexit. A Brexit that is costing taxpayers £250 million today. That, Lord Offord, is the disaster of our times. Mr. Speaker. Can I say Pauline Stafford raised a good point on hers and her tribute that she paid to Fiona Hislop.
Hello.
that she paid, and I'll have to turn my back then to Heather Anderson, who I for a special call-out. What an outstanding advocate, and I'm lucky to have her as a colleague in Dundee. They got the better deal in Dundee West, I expect. Christopher Leask, I mentioned him previously, and a good chance, and I do commit to him that I will work with him. Alan Brown said that Kilmarnock gave us Alexander Fleming, Burns, the cooperative movement. Well, frankly, it also gave us Alan Brown, who's going to be an exceptional addition to this chamber. Sana Dexter-Downey, that was a lekker speech, I thought. I'm looking forward to working with her as well. Murdo, it was good to see the Fable in action. The Fable's lost 7 elections, I understand, against our First Minister. Talked about generous UK-wide benefit whilst turning his back on the rest of Europe, that kind of British exceptionalism that I think has done us down and been so damaging over the years. And Patrick Harvie, you're right. I want to be pushed out my comfort zone, and I think that's something that is exceptionally important. And regardless of disagreement, the threat of misinformation is one that we must all take exceptionally seriously in this chamber. Lord Offord, I'll talk about briefly. Now, I congratulate him on his election. I thank him for his comments. But to refer to the renewables industry and the big fat racket, well, I wish him good luck going up and campaigning in Aberdeen and Dundee and the rest of the North East over the next few weeks while putting those lives at risk. And finally, Michael Mara, who will be in big trouble with the Blairites, I suspect. Oh, dearie me, who inhabit his party, talking about how could a country the size of Scotland possibly manage when other countries are able to manage their own electricity system, set prices according to it, be part of Europe and which reflects on their own resources. And also one who talks about security, when we have to wait for 24 hours for the Navy to respond, and when a UK that doesn't even compete in SAFE in terms of defence procurement, you know, they have pursued a hard Tory Brexit and reform Brexit. We are asking for a very simple thing, that the powers over energy no longer sit in a failed Westminster, but sit in Scotland's Parliament, where the voters of Scotland get to decide their own government. And I beg to move the motion.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes the debate on It's Scotland's Energy. It's now time to move on to the next item of business. There are 6 questions to be put as a result of today's business. Can I remind members that if the amendment in the name of Daniel Johnson is agreed to, the amendments in the name of Duncan Massey and Liam MacArthur will fall. The next question is that Amendment 159.2 in the name of Daniel Johnson, which seeks to amend Motion 159 in the name of Stephen Gethins on It's Scotland's Energy, be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we move to a vote. There will be a short suspension to allow members to access the digital voting system.